The emergence of the Slavic peoples from the broader Proto-Indo-European cultural matrix represents one of the most significant ethnogenetic processes in early medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence suggests that the differentiation of Slavic identity began around the 5th century AD, when distinct material cultures associated with early Slavic communities started appearing across the vast territories stretching from the Carpathian Basin to the Dnieper River Valley. The Prague Korczak culture, identified through characteristic undecorated pottery and semi-subterranean dwellings, provides the earliest concrete archaeological markers of Proto-Slavic settlement patterns. These early Slavic communities emerged from a complex interaction of indigenous populations and migrating groups, creating a distinctive cultural synthesis that would profoundly influence their mythological worldview. The material remains from sites such as Zimno in western Ukraine and Bernashivka reveal settlements organised around central hearths, suggesting communal religious practices centred on fire worship and domestic ritual activities. Excavations at these locations have uncovered small clay figurines, often interpreted as representations of household deities or protective spirits, indicating that religious practice was deeply integrated into daily life from the earliest periods of Slavic cultural development. The migration patterns of these Proto-Slavic groups between the 5th and 7th centuries AD followed major river systems, particularly the Dniester, Dnieper and Vistula, which served not only as transportation corridors, but also as sacred geographical features in emerging mythological narratives. Archaeological evidence from riverside settlements shows concentrations of ritual deposits, including deliberately broken pottery, animal bones from sacrificial meals, and small metal objects that appear to have been offerings to water deities. The Penkovka culture, which succeeded the Prague Korczak tradition, demonstrates increased ritual complexity, with evidence of specialised cult buildings and more elaborate burial practices that suggest developing hierarchical, religious structures. The expansion of Slavic peoples into the Balkans during the 6th and 7th centuries brought them into contact with Byzantine Christian culture, but archaeological evidence indicates that pre-Christian religious practices remained dominant in rural areas for several centuries. Excavations at sites like Popina near Belgrade have revealed ritual complexes featuring circular stone arrangements surrounding central fire altars, suggesting continuity with earlier Proto-Slavic fire worship traditions. These archaeological contexts provide crucial insights into religious practices that would later be reflected in recorded mythological narratives. Sacred sites from this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of landscape symbolism that would become fundamental to Slavic mythological geography. Elevated locations, particularly hilltops near water sources, show concentrated evidence of ritual activity, including deposits of ceramic vessels, metal ornaments and animal remains. The site of Gross Raming in Austria, associated with early Slavic settlement, contains a ritual complex oriented toward cardinal directions, suggesting astronomical knowledge integrated into religious practice. Similar orientational patterns appear at sites across the early Slavic cultural sphere, indicating shared cosmological concepts that transcended local variations. The role of oral tradition in preserving and transmitting mythological narratives across generations cannot be understated in understanding Proto-Slavic religious development. Unlike their Germanic or Celtic neighbours, early Slavic communities left no written records of their pre-Christian beliefs, making reconstruction dependent on later sources filtered through centuries of oral transmission. This reliance on oral tradition created both preservation mechanisms and transformation processes that shaped how mythological narratives evolved across different Slavic cultural groups. Oral transmission among early Slavic communities operated through specialised roles within society, including ritual specialists, storytellers, and craft practitioners who maintained religious knowledge alongside their technical skills. Archaeological evidence suggests that metal workers and potters held particular significance in religious contexts, as indicated by the frequent discovery of ritual objects in association with craft production areas. The integration of mythological knowledge with practical skills created multiple transmission pathways that help preserve core religious concepts while allowing for regional adaptation and innovation. The challenges of reconstructing Proto-Slavic beliefs from fragmented sources require careful analysis of later recorded materials, including medieval chronicles, ethnographic collections, and folklore traditions that preserve archaic elements. The primary chronicle, compiled in the early 12th century, contains references to pre-Christian deities that reflect much earlier traditions, though filtered through Christian interpretative frameworks. Similarly, later folklore collections from across Slavic territories preserve narrative elements, ritual practices, and mythological concepts that demonstrate remarkable consistency, suggesting ancient common origins. Comparative analysis of mythological narratives from different Slavic cultures reveals core structural elements that likely derive from Proto-Slavic traditions. Creation myths featuring cosmic eggs, world trees, and primordial conflicts between order and chaos appear with variations across Slavic cultural groups, indicating shared mythological foundations that predate historical differentiation. The persistence of similar seasonal ritual cycles, particularly those associated with agricultural transitions and solar events, further supports the existence of common Proto-Slavic religious frameworks. Linguistic analysis provides perhaps the most reliable evidence for reconstructing Proto-Slavic religious concepts, as religious terminology tends to be conservative and resistant to borrowing from other languages. The reconstruction of Proto-Slavic theonyms reveals a pantheon structure that emphasizes natural forces, agricultural cycles, and cosmic order. The root appears across Slavic languages in contexts related to wonder, divine power, and supernatural beings, suggesting a fundamental concept of divine manifestation that transcended specific deity names. The theonym Perun, reconstructed from later attestations across Slavic cultures, demonstrates the antiquity of thunder god worship in Proto-Slavic tradition. Linguistic evidence indicates that this deity name derives from Proto-Indo-European roots related to striking and oak trees, connecting Slavic traditions to broader Indo-European mythological patterns while maintaining distinctive Slavic characteristics. The consistency of attributes associated with this deity across different Slavic cultures, including association with oak trees, eagles, and Thursday, suggests that detailed mythological narratives were already established in Proto-Slavic tradition. Religious terminology related to ritual practice reveals sophisticated Proto-Slavic concepts of sacred space and time. The root svet, meaning sacred or holy, appears in numerous contexts related to ritual purity, sacred groves, and festival periods, indicating developed notions of sanctity that structured religious practice. Similarly, terms related to sacrifice, divination, and ritual purification show consistent patterns across Slavic languages, suggesting standardized religious practices that facilitated cultural unity across dispersed communities. The reconstruction of Proto-Slavic cosmological terminology reveals complex understanding of world structure and divine hierarchy. Terms for sky, earth, underworld, and intermediate realms demonstrate systematic organization of cosmic space that provided framework for mythological narratives. The concept of multiple worlds, or levels of existence, reflected in later Slavic folklore and ritual practice, appears to have deep linguistic roots in Proto-Slavic religious vocabulary. Analysis of Proto-Slavic kinship terminology in religious contexts reveals the importance of ancestral worship and family-based ritual practices. Terms distinguishing between different categories of ancestors, protective spirits, and household deities suggest elaborate systems of domestic religious practice that complemented community-level worship. This dual structure of religious organization, combining household and community elements, would remain characteristic of Slavic religious practice throughout its historical development. The linguistic evidence for Proto-Slavic seasonal and agricultural religious terminology demonstrates the central importance of agricultural cycles in mythological thinking. Terms for seasonal festivals, agricultural rituals, and crop-related deities show remarkable consistency across later Slavic languages, indicating that agricultural religion formed a core component of Proto-Slavic religious practice. The integration of seasonal observances with cosmic mythology created comprehensive religious systems that addressed both practical and spiritual needs of early Slavic communities. Proto-Slavic religious vocabulary also reveals sophisticated concepts of fate, destiny, and divine intervention in human affairs. Terms related to fortune, luck, and divine favour suggest developed theological thinking about the relationship between human action and divine will. The persistence of these concepts in later Slavic cultures, often in Christianized forms, demonstrates their fundamental importance in Proto-Slavic worldview and their resistance to complete replacement by foreign religious systems. The sophisticated theological framework that emerged from Proto-Slavic foundations centered around a hierarchical pantheon dominated by powerful deities who governed the fundamental forces of existence. At the apex of this divine hierarchy stood Perun, whose dominion over thunder, lightning, and cosmic justice established him as the supreme deity across virtually all Slavic cultural groups. Archaeological evidence from hilltop sanctuaries throughout Slavic territories reveals the prominence of Perun's worship, with ritual sites consistently featuring elevated stone platforms, oak groves, and evidence of fire ceremonies that honoured this thunderous sovereign of the heavens. The iconography associated with Perun demonstrates remarkable consistency across disparate Slavic regions, suggesting a well-established theological tradition that transcended local variations. Excavations at cult sites such as Perun near Novgorod have uncovered ritual complexes featuring circular stone arrangements with six-petalled flower patterns, interpreted as representations of Perun's sacred symbol. These archaeological contexts contain abundant evidence of metalworking activities, particularly iron forging, which held special significance in Perun's cult as the divine smith who forged lightning bolts in his celestial workshop. The association between metallurgy and divine power reflects deeper cosmological concepts about the transformation of raw materials into instruments of divine will. Perun's role as the wielder of lightning extended far beyond mere weather control into the realm of cosmic justice and divine retribution. Medieval chronicles describe his lightning bolts as weapons of precision, striking down oathbreakers, demons, and enemies of cosmic order with supernatural accuracy. The primary chronicle's account of Prince Vladimir's idol of Perun in Kiev describes a figure with silver head and golden moustache wielding weapons that symbolized his authority over both celestial and terrestrial conflicts. This iconographic tradition reflects theological concepts that positioned Perun as the ultimate arbiter of justice, whose lightning strikes served as visible manifestations of divine judgment upon the world. The sacred oak trees associated with Perun's worship held profound significance in Slavic cosmological thinking, representing the axis mundi that connected earthly and heavenly realms. Archaeological investigation of ancient oak groves near Slavic settlement sites reveals evidence of ritual scarification, offerings deposits, and ceremonial gatherings that honoured Perun through his arboreal manifestations. The chronicon Tietmari describes a sacred oak grove at Rethra, where Slavic priests conducted divination rituals and made offerings to Perun, indicating that these natural sanctuaries served as focal points for community religious life. The association between oak trees and divine power reflected broader Indo-European mythological patterns, while maintaining distinctively Slavic characteristics related to forest-based spirituality. Perun's function as protector of oaths and guarantor of sacred agreements established him as the divine foundation of social order and political authority. Rulers across Slavic territories invoked Perun's name when concluding treaties, making diplomatic agreements, and establishing legal codes that governed community life. The Rus-Byzantine treaties recorded in medieval chronicles consistently invoke Perun alongside other deities as witnesses to international agreements, demonstrating his recognised authority in matters of state and diplomacy. This role as Oath Protector connected Perun's cosmic functions to practical governance, making him simultaneously a transcendent deity and an active participant in human political affairs. The warrior aspect of Perun manifested in elaborate military rituals and battle customs that sought his protection and favour in armed conflicts. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits in rivers and sacred groves suggests that warriors dedicated arms and armour to Perun before major campaigns, seeking his blessing for victory and protection from enemy magic. The practice of ritual weapon breaking, evidenced at sites throughout Slavic territories, may have represented offerings to Perun that demonstrated the warrior's willingness to sacrifice valuable possessions for divine favour. These military associations positioned Perun as the patron deity of the warrior class and the divine source of martial prowess. The eternal conflict between Perun and Veles, the chthonic deity of the underworld, cattle and magic, formed one of the central mythological narratives that explained seasonal changes, agricultural cycles, and cosmic renewal. This divine antagonism represented the fundamental dualistic structure of Slavic cosmology, where order and chaos, sky and earth, culture and wilderness existed in perpetual tension that generated the dynamic forces of existence. Archaeological evidence suggests that this mythological conflict was ritually reenacted during seasonal festivals, with communities taking sides in ceremonial battles that symbolically reproduced the cosmic struggle between opposing divine forces. The primordial deities Rod and Rozhanitsi occupied a foundational position in Slavic theology that predated and transcended the more anthropomorphic pantheon dominated by Perun. Rod, whose name derives from roots related to birth, generation and kinship, represented the ultimate creative principle that brought forth existence from primordial chaos. Medieval Christian polemical texts against paganism consistently identify Rod as a particularly persistent and dangerous deity whose worship continued well into the Christian period, suggesting his fundamental importance in Slavic religious consciousness. Archaeological evidence for Rod's worship appears in domestic contexts rather than monumental sanctuaries, indicating his role as a household deity intimately connected to family lineage and reproductive success. The Rozhanitsi, feminine deities whose name relates to birth and destiny, functioned as Rod's divine companions in governing the processes of generation, fate, and cosmic order. These goddesses presided over childbirth, determined individual destinies, and maintained the threads of fate that connected all living beings to cosmic patterns. Medieval texts describe ritual meals offered to the Rozhanitsi, featuring bread, honey, and cheese arranged in specific patterns that honoured their role in sustaining life and prosperity. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites reveals small clay figurines and offering vessels that may represent material culture associated with Rozhanitsi worship, suggesting that their veneration was primarily a household and community-level religious practice. The theological relationship between Rod and the Rozhanitsi reflected sophisticated concepts about divine gender complementarity and the cosmic principles governing existence. Rod represented the active, generative principle that initiated creation, while the Rozhanitsi embodied the nurturing, sustaining forces that maintained and directed, created life toward its destined purposes. This divine partnership established patterns of cosmic cooperation that influenced Slavic understanding of human relationships, family structures, and social organization. The integration of masculine and feminine divine principles in creation mythology distinguished Slavic theology from purely patriarchal religious systems while maintaining hierarchical structures that reflected social organization. The concept of fate governed by Rod and the Rozhanitsi permeated Slavic understanding of individual destiny and cosmic justice. Unlike deterministic fate concepts found in some mythological systems, Slavic theology presented destiny as a dynamic interaction between divine will, individual choice, and cosmic forces that could be influenced through proper ritual practice and moral behaviour. Archaeological evidence suggests that divination practices seeking guidance from Rod and the Rozhenitsy were common throughout Slavic territories, with specialized ritual objects and sacred spaces dedicated to fortune-telling and fate-reading ceremonies. Svarog emerged as the supreme sky father whose divine craftsmanship established the fundamental laws and structures governing cosmic order. His name, derived from roots related to brightness and sacred fire, positioned him as the celestial smith whose forge produced not only the sun and stars but also the moral and physical laws that maintained universal balance. Medieval sources describe Svarog as the father of other deities, particularly Dazbog, the sun god, establishing him as the patriarch of the divine family, whose authority derived from his role as cosmic creator and lawgiver. The mythological narratives surrounding Svarog's creative activities emphasized his function as divine artificer, who transformed chaotic primordial materials into ordered cosmic structures. His celestial forge, located in the highest heavens, served as the workshop where divine tools, weapons, and celestial bodies were crafted, according to eternal patterns that ensured cosmic stability. Archaeological evidence from metalworking sites throughout Slavic territories reveals ritual practices that honoured Svarog through craft activities, with smiths serving as his earthly representatives who participated in ongoing creation through their technical skills. Svarog's role in establishing cosmic laws extended beyond physical creation into the realm of moral and social order. Medieval sources credit him with giving fire to humanity and teaching the arts of metallurgy, agriculture, and lawmaking that formed the foundation of civilized society. This civilizing function positioned Svarog as the divine source of cultural knowledge and technological innovation, whose gifts enabled human communities to transcend primitive conditions and achieve prosperity through skilled labour and social cooperation. The theological relationship between Svarog and other sky deities reflected hierarchical structures within the celestial realm that mirrored earthly social organisation. As Sky Father, Svarog exercised ultimate authority over weather phenomena, celestial movements and cosmic cycles, while delegating specific functions to subordinate deities who managed particular aspects of divine administration. This divine hierarchy provided a theological model for human political organisation and religious authority, legitimizing earthly rulers who claimed to govern by divine mandate derived from Svarog's cosmic sovereignty. The dualistic cosmology that characterized Slavic mythological thinking manifested in elaborate theological systems that explained existence through eternal conflicts between opposing divine forces. This dualism operated on multiple levels simultaneously, encompassing conflicts between sky and earth, light and darkness, order and chaos, culture and wilderness, life and death, that generated the dynamic tensions necessary for cosmic vitality. Archaeological evidence suggests that seasonal rituals throughout Slavic territories reenacted these cosmic conflicts through ceremonial battles, ritual dramas, and community celebrations that affirmed the ongoing struggle between opposing forces. The mythological conflict between order and chaos found its most dramatic expression in the recurring battles between sky deities and chthonic forces that threatened cosmic stability. These divine wars were not understood as historical events, but as eternal processes that continuously renewed creation through destruction and regeneration. The cyclical nature of these conflicts explained seasonal changes, agricultural cycles, and generational succession as manifestations of cosmic processes that operated according to divine will rather than random chance. The theological significance of light and darkness in Slavic dualistic thinking extended beyond simple moral categories to encompass complex understanding of cosmic balance and divine justice. Light represented not merely goodness but active creative force, divine knowledge and cosmic order, while darkness embodied not evil but necessary destruction, hidden wisdom, and regenerative potential. This sophisticated theological framework avoided simplistic moral dualism while maintaining clear distinctions between constructive and destructive cosmic forces that shaped existence according to divine purposes. The cosmic order established by the supreme deities required intermediary forces to maintain divine influence within the intimate spaces of human existence, leading to the development of an extensive hierarchy of nature spirits whose presence permeated every aspect of Slavic daily life. These supernatural beings operated as divine agents who bridged the gap between transcendent cosmic forces and the immediate practical concerns of agricultural communities, household management, and survival in the natural world. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites throughout Slavic territories reveals the material culture associated with spirit veneration, including small offering vessels, protective amulets, and ritual deposits that demonstrate the central importance of these supernatural intermediaries in maintaining harmony between human communities and the forces of nature. The domovoi stood as the most significant household spirit in Slavic mythology, functioning as the supernatural guardian whose presence determined the prosperity, health, and harmony of individual families. This ancient being manifested as a small, bearded figure covered in grey hair who inhabited the space beneath the threshold, behind the stove, or within the walls of the family dwelling. Medieval sources describe the domovoi as possessing intimate knowledge of family history, genealogical connections, and the moral character of household members, making him simultaneously a protector of worthy families and a stern judge of domestic behaviour. Archaeological excavations of early Slavic dwellings consistently reveal ritual deposits beneath thresholds and near hearth areas, including small ceramic vessels, bread offerings, and textile fragments that represent material evidence of domovoi veneration practices. The complex relationship between the domovoi and human families operated according to strict reciprocal obligations that required consistent attention to ritual propriety and moral behaviour. Families who honoured their household spirit through regular offerings of bread, salt, and grain could expect protection from illness, theft, and supernatural threats, while also receiving warnings about impending dangers through dreams, unusual sounds, or mysterious movements of household objects. The domovoi's protective functions extended beyond mere security to encompass active intervention in family affairs, including matchmaking activities that brought suitable spouses together and disciplinary actions that corrected inappropriate behaviour through supernatural pranks or more serious manifestations. The territorial nature of domovoi authority meant that these spirits remained bound to specific dwellings and could not easily transfer their protection to new locations, creating complex ritual requirements for families who relocated to different homes. Medieval sources describe elaborate ceremonies for inviting the domovoi to accompany families to new residences, involving the transport of coals from the old hearth, ritual offerings presented at the threshold of the new dwelling, and formal invocations that requested the spirit's continued protection. Archaeological evidence suggests that some families maintained portable shrines or ritual objects that facilitated domovoi worship during periods of migration or seasonal movement between agricultural settlements. The domovoi's role in maintaining household harmony extended to supervision of domestic animals, particularly horses, cattle, and poultry, whose health and productivity directly affected family prosperity. These spirits possessed the ability to bless or curse livestock according to the moral behaviour of their human charges, manifesting their displeasure through tangled manes, decreased milk production, or mysterious animal illnesses that defied conventional treatment. Conversely, families who maintained proper relationships with their domovoi could expect supernatural assistance in animal husbandry, including protection from predators, guidance to lost livestock, and enhanced fertility among breeding stock. The gendered aspects of domovoi worship reflected broader Slavic concepts about household organisation and family authority, with these spirits showing particular concern for the behaviour of women whose domestic responsibilities brought them into frequent contact with supernatural forces. The domovoi served as judge of feminine virtue, rewarding industrious wives and mothers with supernatural assistance in cooking, cleaning and childcare while punishing lazy or immoral women through household accidents, spoiled food and crying children. This supervisory function positioned the domovoi as an extension of patriarchal authority that reinforced traditional gender roles through supernatural enforcement of domestic expectations. The seasonal activities of household spirits demonstrated their integration with agricultural cycles and cosmic rhythms that governed rural life throughout Slavic territories. During winter months, the domovoi remained active within the warm spaces near the hearth, accepting offerings and maintaining protective vigilance over the family during the dangerous period when supernatural threats increased. Spring activities involved ritual cleaning ceremonies that honoured the household spirit while preparing the dwelling for renewed agricultural activities, including special offerings that requested the domovoi's blessing for the coming growing season. The leshy emerged as the dominant forest spirit whose authority encompassed all woodland territories and the creatures dwelling within them, functioning as both protector and punisher according to the behaviour of humans who entered his domain. This powerful supernatural being manifested in various forms depending on his intentions and the specific circumstances of human encounters, ranging from a giant whose head touched the treetops to a small woodland creature barely visible among the undergrowth. Medieval chronicles describe the leshy as possessing green hair, bark-like skin, and eyes that glowed with supernatural fire, while his voice could mimic any sound from the forest, including human speech, animal calls, and the creaking of ancient trees. The shape-shifting abilities of the leshy reflected his fundamental connection to the mutable nature of forest environments, where familiar paths could suddenly disappear, recognisable landmarks could shift their positions, and travellers could become hopelessly lost despite their knowledge of local geography. Archaeological evidence from forest ritual sites reveals offering deposits that sought the leshy's favour, including metal objects, food offerings, and textile goods placed at the bases of ancient trees or within natural clearings that served as supernatural gathering places. These archaeological contexts suggest that forest-based religious practices remained active throughout the medieval period, even as Christian influences transformed urban religious life. The leshy's function as guardian of natural law manifested through his punishment of humans who violated forest protocols or showed disrespect for woodland creatures and plant life, hunters who killed more game than needed for survival, woodcutters who felled trees without proper ritual acknowledgement, or travellers who disturbed sacred groves could expect supernatural retribution in the form of disorientation, equipment failure, or encounters with dangerous forest creatures under the leshy's command. Medieval sources describe cases of hunters whose arrows missed impossible targets, loggers whose axes broke against supernatural trees, and travellers who wandered in circles for days despite following familiar paths. The protective aspects of leshy authority extended to all forest creatures, from the largest predators to the smallest insects, creating a supernatural ecology that maintained balance between different species and their environmental requirements. This divine guardianship manifested through the leshy's ability to command animal behaviour, directing predators away from human settlements during times of cooperation, while unleashing them against violators of forest law. The spirit's intimate knowledge of animal languages enabled him to serve as mediator between human and non-human forest inhabitants, facilitating communication and negotiating agreements that allowed sustainable human use of forest resources. The territorial organisation of leshy authority reflected the geographical structure of forest environments, with individual spirits governing specific woodland areas according to natural boundaries such as rivers, mountain ridges, or distinct vegetation zones. Medieval sources suggest that neighbouring leshy spirits maintained complex relationships involving territorial disputes, cooperative agreements, and seasonal gatherings that paralleled human political organisation. Archaeological evidence from boundary areas between different forest zones reveals ritual deposits that may represent offerings made during territorial negotiations, or ceremonies that honoured multiple leshy spirits simultaneously. The seasonal transformations of the leshy demonstrated his integration with cosmic cycles and agricultural rhythms that governed rural life throughout Slavic territories. During summer months, the forest spirit appeared in his most powerful and active form, supervising the growth of vegetation, the breeding of forest animals, and the activities of humans who entered woodland territories. Autumn brought increased supernatural activity as the leshy prepared forest creatures for winter survival, while becoming more dangerous to human intruders who threatened the delicate balance of pre-winter preparations. The rusalka represented the most complex and dangerous category of water spirits, whose origins in human tragedy and supernatural transformation created beings capable of both seductive attraction and deadly vengeance. These female spirits emerged from the souls of women who died by drowning, whether through accident, suicide, or murder, retaining their human appearance while acquiring supernatural powers that enabled them to manipulate water currents, control aquatic creatures, and influence the emotions of living humans who encountered them. Archaeological evidence from waterside ritual sites reveals offering deposits that sought protection from rusalka influence, including textile goods, jewellery, and food offerings placed at springs, riverbanks, and lake shores that served as supernatural gathering places. The seductive powers of the rusalka manifested through their ability to appear as beautiful young women whose singing voices and graceful movements attracted unwary travellers, particularly young men who ventured near water sources during dangerous times such as midnight or the new moon. Medieval sources describe rusalka encounters that began with enchanting songs that drew victims into the water, followed by supernatural seduction that culminated in drowning as the spirit claimed new souls to join their aquatic community. The transformation of human victims into additional water spirits created expanding populations of supernatural beings whose collective power increased the danger associated with specific water bodies. The vengeful aspects of rusalka nature reflected their origins in human tragedy and their continued connection to the circumstances that caused their transformation from living women into supernatural beings. Rusalka who died through violence or betrayal retained particular hostility toward men, using their supernatural abilities to lure male victims into fatal encounters that satisfied their desire for retribution against the gender responsible for their deaths. These vengeful spirits possessed enhanced powers during certain seasonal periods, particularly the week before Pentecost known as Rusalka Week, when their influence extended beyond water sources to encompass nearby forests and agricultural fields. The protective functions of some rusalka spirits demonstrated the complexity of their supernatural nature and their potential for beneficial relationships with human communities that showed proper respect for their tragic origins. Rusalka who died as children or through innocent circumstances sometimes served as guardians of water sources, protecting swimmers from drowning, guiding lost travellers to safety, and ensuring adequate water supplies for agricultural communities. These benevolent water spirits required specific ritual acknowledgements and offering practices that honoured their sacrifice while requesting their continued protection. The Vodyanoi emerged as the masculine counterpart to feminine water spirits, functioning as the supernatural ruler of aquatic domains whose authority encompassed rivers, lakes, ponds, and the creatures dwelling within them. This powerful being manifested as an old man with green hair, iron teeth, and a long beard covered in algae and aquatic vegetation, dwelling in underwater palaces constructed from the bones of drowned victims and furnished with treasures claimed from shipwrecks and water accidents. Medieval chronicles describe the Vodyanoi as possessing vast supernatural powers that enabled him to control water levels, direct fish populations, and command the souls of drowning victims who became his supernatural servants. The territorial nature of Vodyanoi authority meant that each significant water body possessed its own supernatural ruler, whose personality and relationship with human communities varied according to local circumstances and historical events. Some Vodyanoi spirits maintained relatively peaceful coexistence with nearby human settlements, accepting ritual offerings in exchange for protection of fishermen, safe passage for travellers, and adequate water supplies for agricultural activities. Other water rulers harboured hostility toward human communities, using their powers to cause floods, destroy fishing equipment, and claim victims through supernatural manipulation of water currents and weather conditions. The Vodyanoi's role as collector of human souls created complex theological relationships with concepts of death, afterlife, and supernatural justice that reflected broader Slavic beliefs about the fate of individuals who died through drowning. These water spirits maintained underwater prisons where the souls of their victims served as supernatural servants, performing various tasks that maintained the Vodyanoi's aquatic domain while awaiting potential release through ritual intervention or divine judgment. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities near dangerous water bodies conducted regular ceremonies aimed at appeasing local Vodyanoi spirits and securing the release of claimed souls. The polovoi represented the supernatural guardians of agricultural fields whose authority encompassed crop growth, harvest success, and the protection of cultivated lands from supernatural threats and natural disasters. These field spirits manifested as small, dark figures covered in grass and grain stalks who moved through agricultural areas during twilight hours, supervising the growth of crops and punishing humans who violated agricultural protocols or showed disrespect for cultivated lands. Archaeological evidence from agricultural settlements reveals ritual deposits placed at field boundaries, including grain offerings, agricultural tools, and protective amulets that sought polovoi favour during critical periods of the farming cycle. The seasonal activities of field spirits reflected their intimate connection to agricultural rhythms and cosmic cycles that governed rural prosperity throughout Slavic territories. During planting season, the polovoi supervised seed placement, soil preparation, and ritual activities that ensured supernatural blessing for the coming harvest, manifesting their approval through favourable weather conditions and protection from pest infestations. Summer brought increased supernatural activity as field spirits monitored crop growth, directed beneficial insects toward cultivated plants, and maintained the boundaries between agricultural and wild spaces that could threaten harvest success. The protective functions of agricultural spirits extended beyond crop supervision to encompass defense of farming communities against supernatural threats that could destroy cultivated lands and endanger human survival. The polovoi possessed the ability to detect and repel malevolent spirits who sought to damage crops, create adverse weather conditions, or spread diseases among agricultural plants and domestic animals. This protective authority required reciprocal obligations from human communities, including regular offerings, proper ritual acknowledgement, and adherence to traditional farming practices that maintained harmony between human agricultural activities and supernatural forces governing natural fertility. The transition from the vibrant world of nature spirits to the shadowy realms of death and the underworld reveals the most profound and complex aspects of Slavic mythological thinking, where concepts of mortality, cosmic justice, and spiritual transformation intersected with practical concerns about ancestral veneration and the proper treatment of the deceased. Archaeological evidence from burial sites throughout Slavic territories demonstrates sophisticated understanding of death as a transitional process rather than a final termination, with grave goods, ritual deposits, and mortuary architecture reflecting elaborate beliefs about posthumous existence and the journey of souls through supernatural landscapes governed by powerful chthonic deities. Veles emerged as the supreme ruler of the underworld whose dominion encompassed not only the realm of the dead but also the forces of magic, wisdom, cattle, and the wild spaces that existed beyond human cultivation and control. This ancient deity manifested in multiple forms that reflected his complex nature and diverse functions within Slavic cosmology, appearing sometimes as a great serpent whose coils encircled the roots of the world tree, sometimes as a shaggy bear-like creature whose massive form embodied the untamed power of wilderness, and sometimes as an elderly man with a long beard whose eyes held the accumulated wisdom of ages. Medieval sources describe Veles as possessing a voice like distant thunder that could speak all languages, both human and animal, enabling him to serve as mediator between different realms of existence and interpreter of divine will for mortal supplicants. The theological relationship between Veles and Perun formed the fundamental dualistic structure that governed Slavic understanding of cosmic order, seasonal change, and the eternal cycles of creation and destruction that maintained universal balance. This divine antagonism operated on multiple levels simultaneously, encompassing conflicts between sky and earth, order and chaos, culture and wilderness, life and death that generated the dynamic tensions necessary for cosmic vitality. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites throughout Slavic territories reveals ceremonial complexes where the eternal struggle between these opposing deities was ritually reenacted during seasonal festivals, with communities participating in symbolic battles that affirm the ongoing cosmic drama between complementary divine forces. The chthonic nature of Veles positioned him as guardian of the underground waters, mineral wealth, and hidden knowledge that lay beneath the surface of the visible world, making him simultaneously a deity of material prosperity and supernatural wisdom. His association with cattle and livestock reflected not merely pastoral concerns, but deeper theological concepts about wealth, fertility, and the domestication of wild forces for human benefit. Medieval chronicles described magnificent herds of supernatural cattle that grazed in Veles underground pastures, their milk providing nourishment for the souls of the dead, while their hides furnished materials for divine craftwork that maintained the structure of the underworld realm. The magical aspects of Veles' authority encompass divination, shape-shifting, and the manipulation of natural forces through supernatural knowledge that transcended ordinary human understanding. Practitioners of magic throughout Slavic territories invoked Veles' name when performing rituals that required communication with spirits, transformation of physical reality, or access to hidden information about past and future events. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with magical practice reveals ritual deposits that honoured Veles through offerings of metal objects, animal bones, and organic materials that decomposed in ways that symbolically connected the visible world with underground realms of supernatural power. The wisdom attributed to Veles derived from his role as keeper of ancestral knowledge and guardian of the collective memory that preserved cultural traditions across generations of human communities. This divine wisdom encompassed not only practical knowledge about agriculture, animal husbandry, and craft techniques, but also spiritual understanding about the nature of existence, the structure of reality, and the proper relationships between human communities and supernatural forces. Medieval sources credit Veles with teaching humans the arts of poetry, music, and storytelling that preserved mythological narratives and cultural values through oral transmission across centuries of social and political change. The underworld realm governed by Veles consisted of multiple levels and regions that accommodated different categories of deceased souls according to their moral character, social status, and the circumstances of their death. Archaeological evidence from burial sites suggests that Slavic communities understood posthumous existence as a continuation of earthly life in modified form, with the dead requiring food, tools, weapons, and personal possessions that would enable them to maintain their identities and social relationships within supernatural communities. Grave goods from elite burials include elaborate weapons, jewellery, and ceremonial objects that indicate expectations of continued high status within the afterlife hierarchy, while common graves contain practical tools and domestic items that suggest ongoing participation in familiar activities. The journey of souls, from the moment of death to their final destinations within the underworld, involved complex processes of judgment, purification, and transformation that reflected Slavic concepts of divine justice and moral accountability. Medieval sources describe supernatural pathways that connected the world of the living with various regions of the afterlife, including dangerous crossings over rivers of fire, negotiations with guardian spirits who controlled access to different posthumous destinations, and encounters with ancestral figures who provided guidance and protection during the perilous transition between worlds. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities conducted elaborate funeral rituals designed to assist departing souls during these supernatural journeys, including the provision of ritual foods, protective amulets, and ceremonial objects that served as spiritual passports for travel through otherworldly territories. The concept of posthumous judgment in Slavic mythology operated according to principles that emphasize social responsibility, ritual propriety, and adherence to traditional moral codes, rather than abstract theological concepts of sin and redemption. Souls faced evaluation based on their treatment of family members, their fulfillment of community obligations, their respect for supernatural beings and sacred sites, and their maintenance of proper relationships with the natural world. This moral framework positioned death not as punishment for inherent human corruption, but as a natural transition that required preparation through virtuous living and proper ritual observance throughout earthly existence. The various destinations available to deceased souls within Veles underworld reflected the complexity of Slavic social organisation and moral thinking, with different posthumous realms accommodating warriors who died in battle, women who died in childbirth, children who died before reaching maturity, and individuals whose deaths resulted from supernatural causes or divine intervention. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities maintained distinct burial practices for different categories of deceased persons, including separate cemetery areas, specialised grave goods, and unique ritual procedures that reflected beliefs about appropriate posthumous destinations for various types of souls. Baba Yaga occupied a unique position within Slavic death mythology as a liminal figure whose supernatural nature transcended simple categories of good and evil, life and death, helper and hindrance. This ancient being manifested as a skeletal old woman with iron teeth, wild hair, and supernatural powers that enabled her to traverse boundaries between different realms of existence with ease and authority. Her dwelling, a hut that stood on chicken legs and could rotate to face different directions, served as a supernatural threshold between the world of the living and various otherworldly destinations, making her simultaneously a guardian of cosmic boundaries and a guide for souls undertaking posthumous journeys. The ambivalent nature of Baba Yaga's character reflected deeper Slavic understanding of death as a transformational process that could lead to either beneficial or harmful outcomes, depending on the moral character of the deceased and the proper performance of transitional rituals. Medieval folklore describes encounters with Baba Yaga that began with apparent hostility but could develop into helpful relationships if the visitor demonstrated courage, wisdom, and proper respect for supernatural authority. Her testing of human supplicants through dangerous tasks and riddles served as a form of moral evaluation that determined whether individuals deserved assistance in achieving their goals or punishment for their inadequacies. The cannibalistic aspects of Baba Yaga's mythology represented not literal consumption of human flesh, but symbolic transformation processes that enabled spiritual rebirth and access to supernatural knowledge. Her iron teeth and enormous appetite for human visitors symbolized the destructive aspects of death that preceded regeneration and renewal, while her ability to restore life to properly prepared supplicants demonstrated her function as an agent of cosmic transformation rather than mere destruction. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Baba Yaga traditions reveals ritual deposits that included burned bones, metal fragments, and ceramic vessels that may represent material culture related to transformational ceremonies conducted at supernatural thresholds. The wisdom possessed by Baba Yaga encompassed knowledge about the structure of reality, the location of hidden treasures, the secrets of magic and divination, and the proper methods for communicating with various categories of supernatural beings. This otherworldly knowledge made her a valuable ally for heroes undertaking quests that required supernatural assistance, but her willingness to share such information depended on the supplicant's ability to demonstrate worthiness through courage, cleverness, and adherence to proper ritual protocols. Medieval sources describe elaborate bargaining processes between Baba Yaga and human visitors that established reciprocal obligations and mutual respect between mortal and supernatural participants. The domestic aspects of Baba Yaga's character, including her role as hostess who provided food and shelter to worthy travellers, reflected broader Slavic concepts about hospitality obligations that transcended the boundaries between life and death. Her supernatural household operated according to inverted rules that required visitors to adapt their behaviour to otherworldly customs and expectations, creating educational experiences that prepared souls for the challenges they would encounter during posthumous existence. The magical objects and supernatural servants that populated Baba Yaga's dwelling demonstrated the abundance and power available to those who successfully navigated the complexities of otherworldly relationships. The geographical aspects of Baba Yaga's domain positioned her dwelling at the borders between different cosmic realms, particularly at the boundary between the world of the living and the kingdom of the dead ruled by Koschei the Deathless. This liminal location enabled her to serve as gatekeeper who controlled access to various supernatural destinations, while also functioning as guide who could provide directions and assistance to souls undertaking otherworldly journeys. Archaeological evidence from boundary areas between different geographical regions reveals ritual sites that may have served as earthly counterparts to Baba Yaga's cosmic threshold, where communities conducted ceremonies related to death, transformation, and communication with supernatural beings. Death personifications throughout Slavic mythology appeared in various forms that reflected regional variations in beliefs about mortality and posthumous existence, ranging from skeletal figures that embodied the physical aspects of bodily decay to more abstract representations of fate and destiny that governed the timing and circumstances of individual deaths. These supernatural beings functioned as agents of cosmic justice, who ensured that all living creatures fulfilled their destined roles within the universal order before undergoing transformation into posthumous existence. Medieval sources describe encounters with death personifications that emphasized their role as messengers rather than arbitrary destroyers, carrying divine commands that initiated necessary transitions between different states of being. The psychopomp figures who guided souls during their posthumous journeys appeared in forms that reflected local geographical features and cultural traditions, including supernatural birds that carried souls across vast distances, spectral horses that transported the dead through dangerous territories, and anthropomorphic guides who provided protection and instruction during otherworldly travels. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities buried the dead with miniature representations of these psychopomp figures, including small ceramic animals, metal ornaments shaped like birds or horses, and ritual objects that symbolize supernatural transportation methods. These grave goods indicate sophisticated understanding of death as a journey requiring supernatural assistance rather than a simple termination of existence. The regional variations in posthumous beliefs throughout Slavic territories reflected local environmental conditions, historical experiences, and cultural contacts that influenced how different communities understood death and afterlife destinations. Coastal Slavic groups developed elaborate mythologies about souls travelling across supernatural seas to reach otherworldly islands, while mountain communities emphasized journeys through underground passages and caverns that led to subterranean realms. Forest-dwelling Slavs described posthumous paths through enchanted woodlands where ancestral spirits provided guidance and protection, while agricultural communities focused on seasonal cycles of death and rebirth that connected individual mortality with cosmic patterns of renewal and regeneration. The cosmic architecture that emerged from the interplay between supreme deities, nature spirits, and underworld powers required celestial mechanisms to regulate time, seasons, and the fundamental rhythms that governed both divine and mortal existence. Archaeological evidence from astronomical observation sites throughout Slavic territories reveals sophisticated understanding of solar and lunar cycles that extended far beyond practical agricultural applications into complex theological frameworks where celestial bodies functioned as visible manifestations of divine will and cosmic order. Stone circles, earthwork alignments, and ritual complexes oriented toward cardinal directions demonstrate that early Slavic communities possessed detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics integrated with mythological narratives that explained the daily, monthly, and annual cycles through which divine forces maintained universal balance. Dagobog emerged as the preeminent solar deity whose dominion encompassed not merely the physical sun, but the entire complex of divine forces associated with light, warmth, prosperity, and cosmic justice. His name, derived from roots meaning giving god, positioned him as the celestial benefactor whose daily journey across the heavens brought essential gifts of illumination, agricultural fertility, and material abundance to human communities throughout Slavic territories. Medieval chronicles describe Dagobog as manifesting in a golden chariot drawn by fire-breathing horses whose hooves struck sparks from the celestial vault, creating the stars that illuminated the night sky after his daily passage ended. Archaeological excavations at solar cult sites reveal ritual complexes featuring circular stone arrangements, fire altars, and offering deposits that honoured Dagobog through ceremonies timed to coincide with sunrise, solar noon, and sunset transitions that marked critical moments in his daily cosmic cycle. The genealogical connections linking Dagobog to other major deities established him as a central figure within the divine hierarchy, whose authority derived from his position as son of Svarog, the supreme sky father and cosmic lawgiver. This paternal relationship positioned the sun god as inheritor and executor of divine will, responsible for implementing his father's cosmic legislation through the regular cycles of illumination and darkness that structured temporal existence for all created beings. Medieval sources describe elaborate mythological narratives that explained seasonal variations in daylight duration through stories of Dagobog's annual journeys to different celestial realms, including summer palaces where he rested during the longest days and winter retreats where he gathered strength for the renewal of solar power during spring equinox celebrations. The role of Dagobog as giver of wealth extended beyond material prosperity to encompass spiritual enrichment, divine knowledge, and the illumination of consciousness that enabled human beings to distinguish between truth and falsehood, justice and corruption, sacred and profane. His solar rays functioned as vehicles for divine wisdom that penetrated earthly darkness and revealed hidden realities normally concealed from mortal perception. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Dagobog worship includes gold and amber objects, precious metal ornaments, and elaborate jewellery that reflected beliefs about solar energy as the source of all valuable materials found within the earth. These ritual deposits suggest that communities understood material wealth as manifestations of divine favour that required proper acknowledgement through ceremonial offerings and moral behaviour that maintained harmony with cosmic justice. The daily cosmic cycle governed by Dagobog involved complex interactions with other celestial and terrestrial deities, whose cooperation ensured the proper functioning of natural processes essential for human survival and cosmic stability. His morning emergence from the eastern horizon required the assistance of dawn goddesses who prepared the sky for solar illumination, while his evening descent into western realms involved negotiations with underworld powers who provided safe passage through nocturnal territories ruled by chthonic deities. Medieval mythological narratives describe these daily transitions as heroic journeys that required Dagobog to overcome supernatural obstacles, defeat hostile forces, and maintain his divine authority against challenges from competing cosmic powers who sought to disrupt the regular alternation of day and night. The protective functions of the solar deity manifested through his ability to dispel darkness, reveal hidden enemies, and provide divine illumination that enabled human communities to detect and resist supernatural threats that operated under cover of night. His rays possessed purifying properties that cleansed ritual spaces, sanctified ceremonial objects, and destroyed malevolent influences that could corrupt sacred activities or endanger community welfare. Archaeological evidence suggests that Slavic communities conducted sunrise ceremonies that invoked Dazbog's protection for the coming day, including ritual lighting of fires, presentation of food offerings, and recitation of prayers that requested solar blessing for agricultural work, travel, and other activities that required divine favour for successful completion. The agricultural significance of Dazbog worship reflected the fundamental importance of solar energy for crop growth, livestock health, and the seasonal cycles that determined community prosperity throughout Slavic territories. His influence over weather patterns, soil fertility, and plant development made him essential for successful farming, while his role in determining seasonal transitions affected the timing of planting, cultivation, and harvest activities that sustained rural populations. Medieval sources describe elaborate agricultural ceremonies that honoured Dazbog during critical moments of the farming cycle, including spring planting festivals that requested solar blessing for seed germination, midsummer celebrations that acknowledged his maximum power during the longest days, and harvest ceremonies that thanked him for bringing crops to maturity through sustained solar energy. The juridical aspects of Dazbog's authority positioned him as divine witness, whose illuminating presence revealed truth and exposed falsehood during legal proceedings, oath-taking ceremonies, and conflict resolution processes that required supernatural validation of human testimony. His solar rays functioned as instruments of cosmic justice that could reveal hidden crimes, expose perjury, and provide divine guidance for judges who needed supernatural assistance in determining appropriate punishments for various offences. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with legal assemblies include solar symbols, ritual fire installations, and offering deposits that suggest communities conducted judicial proceedings in locations where Dazbog's presence could provide divine oversight of human justice systems. Kors represented a distinct solar deity whose worship reflected the complex religious syncretism that characterized Slavic mythology through its integration of foreign influences with indigenous traditions. His name, possibly derived from Persian or Turkic linguistic roots, suggests cultural contact between Slavic communities and nomadic peoples from the Eurasian steppes who brought alternative solar worship traditions that complemented rather than replaced existing Dazbog veneration. Medieval chronicles, particularly the primary chronicle's account of Prince Vladimir's pantheon in Kiev, positioned Kors alongside other major deities in ways that indicate his recognised authority within official religious hierarchies, though his specific functions and mythological narratives remain less detailed than those associated with other solar figures. The Scythian or Turkic influences evident in Kors worship demonstrate the dynamic nature of Slavic religious development and the community's willingness to incorporate beneficial foreign elements that enhanced rather than contradicted existing theological frameworks. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with nomadic cultural contact reveals ritual objects, artistic motifs, and architectural features that blend Slavic and steppe traditions in ways that suggest peaceful religious exchange rather than forced conversion or cultural domination. These archaeological contexts include horse burials, metalwork featuring solar symbolism, and ceremonial weapons that reflect the military associations often connected with nomadic solar deities. The aspects of solar worship represented by Kors may have emphasized different seasonal periods, geographical orientations, or social functions than those governed by Dazbog, creating complementary rather than competing divine authorities that addressed various community needs throughout the annual cycle. Some scholarly interpretations suggest that Kors governed winter solar phenomena, including the low-angle illumination and shortened daylight periods, that required different ritual approaches than the abundant summer solar energy associated with Dazbog worship. This seasonal differentiation would have provided theological explanations for the varying intensity and duration of solar influence throughout the year, while maintaining unified solar worship traditions that acknowledged multiple aspects of divine solar power. The syncretistic nature of cause veneration reflected broader patterns of cultural exchange that characterized medieval Slavic territories, where trade relationships, diplomatic contacts, and population movements created opportunities for religious innovation and theological development. Communities that maintained contact with nomadic peoples through commercial activities, military alliances, or intermarriage relationships would have encountered alternative religious practices that offered new perspectives on familiar divine forces. The integration of these foreign elements into existing religious frameworks required careful theological work that preserved essential Slavic characteristics while incorporating beneficial innovations that enhanced community spiritual resources. The complexity of Slavic religious syncretism evident in cause worship demonstrates sophisticated theological thinking that avoided simple cultural borrowing in favour of creative integration that strengthened rather than weakened existing religious traditions. This process required detailed understanding of both indigenous and foreign religious systems, careful evaluation of theological compatibility, and innovative ritual development that honoured multiple cultural sources while maintaining coherent community religious identity. Archaeological evidence suggests that such syncretistic developments occurred gradually through sustained cultural contact rather than sudden religious revolution, allowing communities time to evaluate and adapt foreign influences according to local needs and preferences. Lunar deities within Slavic mythology operated according to different temporal rhythms and cosmic functions than their solar counterparts, governing the monthly cycles, tidal influences, and nocturnal activities that complemented rather than competed with solar authority over daily and seasonal patterns. The moon's association with feminine principles, fertility cycles, and the measurement of time created theological frameworks that emphasized cyclical renewal, reproductive processes, and the hidden wisdom that operated during darkness when solar illumination temporarily withdrew from earthly realms. Archaeological evidence from lunar cult sites reveals ritual complexes oriented towards moonrise positions, crescent-shaped offering vessels, and silver objects that reflected beliefs about lunar energy as a distinct form of divine power that required specialized worship practices and ceremonial acknowledgements. The fertility associations of lunar worship connected monthly celestial cycles with female reproductive rhythms, agricultural planting schedules, and animal breeding patterns that determined community prosperity and biological continuity throughout Slavic territories. Medieval sources describe lunar goddesses whose influence over conception, pregnancy, and childbirth made them essential figures for women seeking divine assistance with reproductive challenges and family planning concerns. These lunar deities possessed knowledge about herbal medicines, birthing procedures, and infant care that they shared with human women through dreams, visions, and ritual communications that occurred during specific lunar phases when their power reached maximum intensity. The temporal measurement functions of lunar deities reflected their role in establishing calendrical systems that coordinated religious festivals, agricultural activities, and social events according to celestial rhythms that transcended local geographical variations. The lunar month provided a universal temporal standard that enabled different Slavic communities to synchronize their ceremonial activities and maintain cultural connections despite geographical separation and political fragmentation. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities used lunar observations to coordinate regional festivals, trade gatherings, and diplomatic meetings that required precise timing to ensure maximum participation and effectiveness. The nocturnal aspects of lunar authority encompass divination practices, magical rituals, and communication with supernatural beings that operated more effectively during darkness when solar energy did not interfere with subtle spiritual influences. Lunar deities possess special knowledge about dream interpretation, prophetic visions, and the manipulation of supernatural forces that could provide guidance, protection, and assistance for human supplicants who approached them with proper ritual preparation and moral worthiness. Medieval sources describe elaborate nocturnal ceremonies conducted during specific lunar phases that enable practitioners to access hidden knowledge, communicate with ancestral spirits, and perform magical operations that required lunar energy for successful completion. The relationship between lunar and solar deities reflected broader Slavic concepts about cosmic complementarity and the necessity of balanced divine forces for maintaining universal harmony and natural stability. These celestial powers operated according to coordinated schedules that ensured continuous divine oversight of earthly affairs through alternating periods of solar and lunar influence that addressed different community needs and spiritual requirements. The integration of solar and lunar worship created comprehensive religious systems that provided theological explanations and ritual resources for all temporal cycles and seasonal transitions that affected human communities throughout the annual calendar. Seasonal solar festivals represented the most elaborate and socially significant religious celebrations within Slavic communities, marking critical transitions in the cosmic year that required community participation in ceremonial activities that honoured solar deities while ensuring continued divine favour for agricultural prosperity and social harmony. Archaeological evidence from festival sites reveals large-scale ritual installations, communal feasting areas, and ceremonial objects that indicate these celebrations involved entire communities and coordinated religious activities that strengthened social bonds while fulfilling religious obligations to solar powers. The timing of these festivals, according to astronomical observations, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics integrated with theological concepts about divine intervention in human affairs. The winter solstice celebrations marked the critical moment when solar power reached its minimum influence and began the gradual process of renewal that would eventually restore full illumination and warmth to earthly realms. Medieval sources describe elaborate ceremonies that involved ritual lighting of fires, presentation of special foods, and community gatherings that provided social support during the darkest period of the annual cycle. Archaeological evidence from winter solstice sites includes large fire installations, ceramic vessels containing ritual foods, and offering deposits that suggest communities conducted intensive ceremonial activities designed to assist Dashbog during his annual renewal process, while ensuring community survival through the dangerous winter months. The summer solstice festivals celebrated the maximum power of solar deities and their successful completion of the annual cycle that brought agricultural abundance, extended daylight, and optimal conditions for community prosperity and social activities. These celebrations involved elaborate displays of community wealth, competitive games and contests, and ceremonial exchanges that strengthened social relationships, while acknowledging divine generosity and providing favourable conditions for human flourishing. Archaeological evidence suggests that summer solstice celebrations attracted participants from multiple communities and may have served as regional gatherings that facilitated trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange between different Slavic groups. The equinox celebrations marked the balanced moments when solar and lunar influences achieved temporary equilibrium, creating optimal conditions for activities that required coordination between different divine forces and careful timing according to celestial rhythms. Spring equinox festivals emphasized renewal, planting, and the restoration of agricultural activities after winter dormancy, while autumn equinox celebrations focused on harvest completion, preparation for winter challenges, and thanksgiving for divine assistance throughout the growing season. These transitional festivals required precise astronomical observation and sophisticated ritual coordination that demonstrated the advanced theological and technical knowledge possessed by Slavic religious specialists who maintained community relationships with celestial deities. The cosmic balance maintained through solar and lunar cycles required additional divine mechanisms to address the inevitable conflicts, moral transgressions, and supernatural threats that emerged when human communities failed to maintain proper relationships with divine forces or when external enemies challenged the established order of Slavic territories. Archaeological evidence from fortified cult sites throughout the Baltic coastline and inland river systems reveals the emergence of specialized warrior deities whose authority encompassed not merely military victory, but the broader concepts of divine justice, cosmic protection, and the maintenance of moral order through supernatural intervention in human conflicts. Svetovid commanded supreme authority as the four-faced god, whose multiple visages enabled him to observe all directions simultaneously, ensuring comprehensive surveillance of threats approaching Slavic territories from any quarter. His cult centre at Arkona on Rugen Island functioned as the most significant religious and political sanctuary in the Western Slavic world, where a massive wooden idol dominated a circular temple complex that served as the focal point for regional military confederations and diplomatic alliances. Medieval chroniclers, particularly Saxo Grammaticus and Helmold of Bissau, provide detailed descriptions of this sanctuary that reveal the sophisticated religious architecture and elaborate ceremonial practices that maintained Svetovid's worship among the Rugian Slavs and their allies throughout the southern Baltic region. The four faces of Svetovid represented not merely comprehensive observation, but distinct aspects of divine authority that governed different categories of cosmic and terrestrial affairs. The eastern face oversaw the dawn and new beginnings, supervising the initiation of military campaigns, the establishment of new settlements, and the renewal of oaths and alliances that bound communities together in mutual defence agreements. The southern face governed the zenith of solar power and the height of military strength, presiding over battles fought during summer campaigns, when weather conditions favoured large-scale military operations and siege warfare. The western face controlled sunset and the conclusion of conflicts, determining the terms of peace treaties, the distribution of war spoils, and the proper treatment of defeated enemies according to divine justice principles. The northern face supervised the dark season and defensive warfare, providing protection against winter raids, supernatural threats, and the various dangers that emerged during periods when reduced daylight weakened community defences. The temple complex at Arkona demonstrated sophisticated religious architecture that integrated military symbolism with cosmic representations, creating a sacred space that functioned simultaneously as fortress, sanctuary, and astronomical observation centre. Archaeological investigations conducted before the site's destruction by Danish forces in 1168 revealed massive earthwork fortifications surrounding a central wooden temple whose construction incorporated precise astronomical alignments that connected Svetovid's worship with celestial cycles governing military activities. The temple's interior featured a central chamber dominated by the four-faced idol, surrounded by weapon deposits, treasure chambers, and ritual spaces where priests conducted divination ceremonies that guided military planning and diplomatic negotiations. The divination practices associated with Svetovid worship involved complex ceremonies that utilised the god's prophetic powers to determine favourable timing for military campaigns, evaluate the likelihood of victory in proposed conflicts, and assess the supernatural forces affecting regional political situations. Medieval sources describe elaborate rituals involving sacred horses whose behaviour provided omens about future military success, ceremonial casting of lots that revealed divine preferences regarding strategic decisions, and dream interpretation practices that enabled priests to communicate Svetovid's guidance to military leaders and political authorities. Archaeological evidence from the Arkona sanctuary includes specialised ritual objects used in these divination ceremonies, including carved wooden implements, metal casting pieces, and ceramic vessels that contained offerings presented during prophetic consultations. The military functions of Svetovid extended beyond mere battlefield victory to encompass the broader concept of cosmic warfare between order and chaos, civilization and barbarism, sacred and profane forces that threatened the stability of Slavic communities and their religious traditions. His role as protector against foreign enemies positioned him as the divine champion of Slavic cultural identity and religious autonomy, whose supernatural intervention could defeat not only human armies, but also the malevolent spiritual influences that accompanied foreign conquest and cultural domination. Medieval chronicles describe miraculous military victories attributed to Svetovid's intervention, including sudden weather changes that disrupted enemy operations, supernatural confusion that caused opposing forces to attack each other, and divine inspiration that enabled outnumbered Slavic warriors to achieve impossible tactical successes. The political significance of Svetovid worship created a religious framework that legitimized military alliances and political confederations among different Slavic tribes and communities that recognized his supreme authority in matters of war and peace. The annual festivals held at Arkana attracted representatives from throughout the Baltic Slavic region, creating opportunities for diplomatic negotiations, military planning, and cultural exchange that strengthened regional unity against common enemies. These gatherings involved elaborate ceremonies that renewed oaths of mutual defence, coordinated military strategies, and distributed resources necessary for maintaining effective resistance against German expansion and Danish raids that threatened Slavic political independence. The economic aspects of Svetovid's cult reflected the integration of religious authority with military financing and resource management that enabled sustained resistance against foreign conquest attempts. The temple at Arkona served as a regional treasury where communities contributed portions of their agricultural surplus, craft production, and trade profits to fund military expeditions, fortification construction, and weapon manufacturing that supported collective defence efforts. Archaeological evidence suggests that the sanctuary maintained extensive storage facilities, metalworking installations, and administrative buildings that managed the complex economic operations necessary for coordinating large-scale military activities across multiple political entities. The warrior priesthood associated with Svetovid worship combined religious authority with military expertise, creating a specialized class of religious professionals who possessed both spiritual knowledge and practical combat skills necessary for leading communities during periods of military crisis. These priest-warriors underwent extensive training in divination practices, ritual procedures, weapon use, and military tactics that enabled them to serve as intermediaries between divine and human authority, while providing practical leadership during conflicts. Medieval sources describe the elaborate initiation ceremonies, ongoing educational requirements, and strict moral codes that governed this warrior priesthood and maintained their effectiveness as both spiritual guides and military commanders. The Zoraya emerged as the divine guardians whose vigilant protection maintained cosmic order against the fundamental threat posed by the celestial wolf or hound, whose escape from supernatural bonds would result in the destruction of the sun and the collapse of universal stability. These dawn maidens manifested as three sister goddesses whose coordinated activities ensure the daily renewal of solar energy and the continuous operation of celestial mechanisms that govern temporal existence for all created beings. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with dawn worship reveals ritual complexes oriented towards sunrise positions, offering deposits timed to coincide with early morning hours, and specialized ceremonial objects that honored these protective deities during their critical work of cosmic maintenance. The names and specific functions of the three Zoraya sisters reflected their roles in managing different aspects of the daily cosmic cycle that required divine intervention to ensure proper operation. Zoria Utrenyaya, the morning star, supervised the opening of celestial gates that enabled the sun to begin its daily journey across the heavens, while also maintaining the chains that bound the cosmic wolf during daylight hours when its destructive potential posed the greatest threat to universal stability. Zoria Vechernyaya, the evening star, controlled the closing of these celestial barriers and the reinforcement of supernatural bonds that contained chaotic forces during nocturnal periods, when reduced solar energy weakened cosmic defences. Zoria Polonochnaya, the midnight star, maintained vigilant watch during the darkest hours when the cosmic wolf's attempts to break free reached maximum intensity, requiring constant divine attention to prevent catastrophic escape. The cosmic significance of the Zoraya's protective functions extended far beyond astronomical phenomena to encompass the fundamental struggle between order and chaos that determined the continued existence of all created beings and the stability of natural laws governing physical reality. The celestial wolf, or hound, represented primordial chaos in its most concentrated and dangerous form, possessing the power to devour not only the sun but also the entire cosmic structure that maintained the separation between different realms of existence. Medieval mythological narratives describe this supernatural creature as growing stronger during periods of moral corruption, social conflict, and religious neglect that weakened the spiritual foundation supporting cosmic order and enabled chaotic forces to gain influence over earthly affairs. The binding of the cosmic wolf required continuous divine effort and human cooperation through proper ritual observance, moral behaviour, and community solidarity that strengthened the supernatural chains restraining this ultimate threat to universal stability. The Zoraya sisters possessed the knowledge and power necessary to maintain these cosmic bonds, but their effectiveness depended on receiving adequate support from human communities through regular offerings, ceremonial acknowledgements, and adherence to moral codes that prevented the spiritual corruption that could weaken divine authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities throughout Slavic territories conducted daily dawn ceremonies that honoured the Zoraya and contributed to their ongoing work of cosmic protection through ritual participation in the struggle against chaotic forces. The prophetic aspects of Zoraya worship involve their role as divine messengers who provided warnings about impending threats to cosmic stability, including periods when the cosmic wolf's escape attempts reached dangerous intensity and required enhanced protective measures from both divine and human participants. These dawn goddesses possessed the ability to communicate through dreams, omens, and supernatural signs that alerted communities to spiritual dangers, moral crises, and external threats that could compromise cosmic security if not addressed through appropriate ritual and practical responses. Medieval sources describe elaborate divination practices that sought guidance from the Zoraya regarding optimal timing for important activities, evaluation of supernatural threats, and assessment of community spiritual health that affected cosmic stability. The protective functions of the Zoraya extended beyond cosmic maintenance to encompass direct intervention in human affairs when communities faced threats that exceeded their capacity for conventional resistance or defense. These dawn goddesses possessed the power to manipulate weather conditions, influence enemy behaviour, and provide supernatural assistance during military conflicts that threatened the survival of communities that maintained proper relationships with divine authority. Their intervention typically manifested through subtle influences that enhanced human capabilities rather than direct miraculous intervention, enabling communities to achieve victory through improved coordination, enhanced courage, and optimal timing that reflected divine favour rather than supernatural coercion. The daily renewal ceremonies associated with Zoraya worship created ritualized participation in cosmic processes that connected individual and community activities with universal patterns of regeneration and protection that maintained both spiritual and physical well-being. These morning observances involved the lighting of fires that symbolically assisted solar renewal, the presentation of offerings that honoured divine protective efforts, and the recitation of prayers that acknowledged human dependence on divine intervention for continued existence. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites throughout Slavic territories reveals small altars, ritual hearths, and offering vessels that suggest these daily ceremonies were conducted at household levels as well as community gatherings, creating multiple layers of ritual support for cosmic maintenance. The concepts of divine justice that permeated Slavic religious thinking operated according to principles that emphasize community responsibility, moral reciprocity, and supernatural enforcement of ethical codes that governed relationships between individuals, families, and larger social groups. Archaeological evidence from judicial sites throughout Slavic territories reveals ritual installations, oath-taking facilities, and ceremonial objects that demonstrate the integration of religious authority with legal processes and conflict resolution procedures that required divine validation for effectiveness and community acceptance. These sacred legal spaces typically featured elevated platforms for judicial proceedings, fire altars for oath ceremonies, and offering deposits that honoured deities whose authority legitimised human justice systems. The punishment of oathbreakers represented one of the most serious concerns within Slavic concepts of divine justice, as violations of sworn agreements threatened the fundamental trust relationships that enabled community cooperation and political stability. Deities responsible for oath enforcement possessed the power to inflict supernatural punishment on individuals who violated sacred commitments, including illness, accident, economic failure, and social ostracism that served as visible demonstrations of divine displeasure with moral corruption. Medieval sources describe elaborate oath-taking ceremonies that invoked multiple deities as witnesses to agreements, creating supernatural accountability systems that deterred violations through fear of divine retribution, while providing spiritual validation for honest dealings between community members. The enforcement of sacred laws extended beyond individual moral behaviour to encompass community obligations toward deities, ancestors, and supernatural beings whose continued favour required adherence to traditional practices and ritual observances that maintained proper relationships between human and divine realms. Violations of these sacred laws could result in collective punishment that affected entire communities through natural disasters, military defeats, epidemic diseases, and agricultural failures that demonstrated divine displeasure with communal moral corruption. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities conducted regular purification ceremonies designed to address potential violations of sacred laws and restore proper relationships with divine authority through collective repentance and renewed commitment to traditional practices. The warrior cults that emerged throughout Slavic territories created specialized religious frameworks that addressed the unique spiritual needs of professional fighters and military leaders whose occupations required divine protection, supernatural courage, and access to battle fury that transcended normal human limitations. These martial religious traditions combined practical military training with spiritual preparation that enabled warriors to achieve altered states of consciousness during combat, receive divine inspiration for tactical decisions, and maintain psychological resilience during the extreme stress of life-threatening conflicts. Archaeological evidence from warrior burial sites reveals specialized weapons, protective amulets, and ritual objects that indicate the sophisticated religious practices that supported military effectiveness through supernatural means. The divine inspiration of battle fury represented a central element in warrior cult mythology, where deities granted temporary possession or supernatural enhancement that transformed ordinary fighters into invincible champions capable of achieving impossible feats of strength, speed, and tactical brilliance. This divine battle madness manifested through altered states of consciousness that eliminated fear, enhanced physical capabilities, and provided supernatural knowledge about enemy weaknesses and optimal combat strategies. Medieval sources describe warriors who entered these inspired states as becoming temporarily divine themselves, immune to normal weapons, and possessed of supernatural powers that enabled them to defeat multiple opponents and survive otherwise fatal injuries. The sacred nature of martial prowess within Slavic warrior cults positioned military skill as a divine gift that required proper spiritual preparation, ongoing ritual maintenance, and moral behaviour that maintained the warrior's worthiness to receive supernatural assistance during combat situations. This theological framework created comprehensive training systems that integrated physical conditioning, weapon mastery, tactical education, and spiritual development into unified programs that produced not merely effective fighters, but religiously sanctified champions whose military success demonstrated divine favour and community spiritual health. The warrior's relationship with patron deities required continuous attention through regular offerings, ceremonial observances, and adherence to moral codes that maintained supernatural protection and battle effectiveness throughout their military careers. The warrior cults and concepts of divine justice that governed Slavic understanding of cosmic order emerged from fundamental creation narratives that explained how the universe itself came into existence through divine action and supernatural conflict. These cosmogonic traditions, preserved in oral transmission across centuries, reveal sophisticated theological thinking about the origins of matter, the establishment of natural laws, and the emergence of the structured reality that provided the foundation for all subsequent mythological development. Archaeological evidence from the earliest Slavic settlement sites demonstrates that creation mythology influenced practical activities including site selection, architectural orientation, and ritual practices that connected human communities with the primordial forces responsible for universal existence. The Earth Diver creation myth formed the cornerstone of Slavic cosmogonic thinking, describing how divine beings retrieved solid matter from primordial waters to construct the terrestrial realm that would support life and provide the foundation for cosmic order. This narrative tradition, shared across Indo-European cultures but distinctively developed within Slavic contexts, featured a supreme deity who commanded a subordinate divine being to dive beneath the surface of the primordial ocean and bring up the clay or earth necessary for world construction. The diving deity, often identified with later chthonic figures such as Veles, succeeded in this cosmic mission despite supernatural obstacles and resistance from chaotic forces that sought to prevent the establishment of ordered reality. The primordial waters that preceded terrestrial creation represented not empty void, but active chaos containing all potential forms of existence in undifferentiated unity that required divine intervention to separate into distinct categories of being. Medieval sources describe these cosmic waters as possessing consciousness and will, actively resisting divine attempts to impose structure and order upon their fluid chaos. The water's opposition to creation manifested through their attempts to drown the diving deity, dissolve the retrieved earth before it could be shaped into stable landforms, and flood the newly created terrestrial realm to return existence to its original chaotic state. This ongoing conflict between ordered creation and chaotic dissolution provided theological explanation for natural disasters, seasonal flooding, and the constant maintenance required to preserve civilized life against destructive natural forces. The divine cooperation required for successful earth diving demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cosmic complementarity and the necessity of multiple divine powers working together to achieve creation goals that exceeded the capabilities of individual deities. The supreme deity who commanded the diving mission possessed ultimate authority and creative vision, but required the specialized abilities of the diving deity, who could navigate underwater realms and manipulate primordial materials according to divine specifications. This collaborative creation model established patterns of divine interaction that influenced later mythological narratives about cooperation between sky and earth deities, the coordination required for seasonal transitions, and the ongoing maintenance of cosmic order through coordinated divine activity. Regional variations in the Earth Diver narrative reflected local geographical conditions and cultural adaptations that modified basic cosmogonic themes according to specific environmental contexts and historical experiences. Coastal Slavic communities emphasized the marine aspects of primordial waters and described creation as emerging from supernatural seas that resembled their familiar maritime environments. River-dwelling Slavs developed versions that featured freshwater contexts and incorporated local river systems into cosmogonic geography, while mountain communities described creation emerging from highland lakes and underground water sources that reflected their alpine surroundings. These regional adaptations maintained core narrative elements while adapting cosmogonic imagery to familiar landscapes that enabled communities to understand creation as occurring within recognizable geographical frameworks. The Indo-European connections evident in Slavic Earth Diver mythology demonstrate the ancient origins of these creation narratives and their shared development with related mythological traditions found throughout the broader linguistic family. Comparative analysis reveals structural similarities between Slavic creation myths and corresponding traditions, preserved in Germanic, Celtic, Baltic, and Indo-Iranian cultures that suggest common Proto-Indo-European origins for basic cosmogonic concepts. However, Slavic development of these shared themes incorporated distinctive elements that reflected specific cultural values, environmental adaptations, and theological innovations that distinguished Slavic creation mythology from parallel traditions while maintaining recognizable connections to broader Indo-European cosmogonic thinking. The theological implications of Earth-diver creation extended beyond mere explanation of terrestrial origins to encompass fundamental concepts about the relationship between order and chaos, divine authority and material resistance, creative cooperation and destructive opposition that governed ongoing cosmic processes. The successful retrieval of Earth from chaotic waters established divine authority over primordial forces while demonstrating that creation required continuous effort and vigilance to maintain ordered reality against persistent threats from chaotic dissolution. This creation model provided theological foundation for understanding natural disasters as temporary victories of chaotic forces, seasonal cycles as ongoing negotiations between order and chaos, and human civilization as participation in divine creative activity through agriculture, architecture, and social organization. The world tree emerged as the fundamental cosmic structure that connected different realms of existence and provided the architectural framework supporting universal order established through Earth-diver creation. This massive supernatural tree, known by various names throughout Slavic territories, but consistently described as possessing enormous size and cosmic significance, extended its roots deep into the underworld realms governed by chthonic deities while raising its crown high into celestial regions occupied by sky gods and stellar powers. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with sacred groves reveals the veneration of actual trees that served as earthly representations of the cosmic world tree, including oak, ash, and birch specimens that received ritual offerings and served as focal points for community religious activities. The tripartite cosmic structure supported by the world tree reflected sophisticated understanding of universal organization and the hierarchical relationships governing different categories of existence within the created order. The underground root system connected with chthonic realms where ancestral spirits, earth deities, and the souls of the dead maintained their posthumous existence under the authority of underworld rulers such as Veles. The massive trunk occupied the middle realm of terrestrial existence where human communities, nature spirits, and earthly deities conducted their activities within the physical landscape created through Earth-diver mythology. The elevated crown reached into celestial regions where sky deities, stellar powers, and cosmic forces maintained their divine activities while supervising the operation of universal laws and seasonal cycles. The world tree functioned as the axis mundi that provided structural stability for the entire cosmos and served as the pathway enabling communication and travel between different levels of existence. Divine beings, supernatural spirits, and qualified human souls could ascend or descend along the world tree's length to visit other cosmic realms, carry messages between different categories of beings, and participate in inter-realm activities that required coordination between terrestrial, chthonic, and celestial powers. Medieval sources describe shamanic practitioners and religious specialists who possessed the knowledge and spiritual preparation necessary to undertake world tree journeys during ritual trances, enabling them to communicate with deities, consult ancestral wisdom, and obtain supernatural knowledge unavailable through ordinary terrestrial experience. The seasonal changes affecting the world tree reflected cosmic cycles and divine activities that influence conditions throughout all levels of existence simultaneously. Spring brought renewed growth to the world tree's foliage, symbolizing the revival of creative forces and the restoration of communication pathways between different cosmic realms after winter's temporary isolation. Summer manifested through the tree's maximum vitality and the peak efficiency of interrealm connections that enabled optimal coordination between divine powers and earthly activities. Autumn brought the gradual withdrawal of the tree's active energy, and the preparation for winter dormancy that would temporarily reduce but not eliminate the cosmic connections maintained through the world tree's enduring structure. The various deities and spirits associated with different parts of the world tree created a complex supernatural ecology that governed cosmic functions and maintained the proper operation of inter-realm relationships essential for universal stability. Sky deities inhabited the uppermost branches and utilised the tree's crown as their celestial palace, meeting hall and observation platform for supervising earthly affairs. Terrestrial spirits occupied the middle regions of the trunk and major branches, using these cosmic pathways to travel between different geographical locations and coordinate their activities with related supernatural beings. Chthonic powers dwelt among the underground root system and employed these subterranean connections to maintain communication with surface world activities while preserving their authority over underworld realms and posthumous existence. The protective functions of the world tree extended beyond mere structural support to encompass active defense of cosmic order against supernatural threats that sought to disrupt universal stability and destroy the organized reality established through divine creation. The tree's massive size and supernatural durability enabled it to withstand attacks from chaotic forces, while its deep roots and high crown provided secure anchoring that prevented cosmic collapse during periods of supernatural conflict. Medieval mythological narratives describe battles fought around the world tree between forces of order and chaos, with the tree serving as both battlefield and fortress that determined the outcome of cosmic struggles affecting all levels of existence. Flood myths within Slavic cosmogonic tradition described periodic episodes of world destruction and renewal that cleansed creation of accumulated corruption, while providing opportunities for cosmic regeneration and the restoration of proper relationships between divine and earthly powers. These catastrophic events represented not random disasters, but deliberate divine interventions designed to address moral decay, supernatural imbalance, and the gradual deterioration of cosmic order that occurred through the accumulation of violations against sacred laws and proper ritual observance. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with flood traditions reveals ritual deposits and ceremonial installations that suggest communities conducted regular ceremonies aimed at preventing catastrophic flooding through proper divine propitiation and community moral purification. The causes of cosmic flooding typically involved the accumulated weight of human moral corruption, violations of sacred laws, and neglect of proper ritual obligations that weakened divine protection and enabled chaotic forces to temporarily overcome the ordered structures maintaining universal stability. Medieval sources describe how communities that abandoned traditional religious practices, violated oath obligations, or failed to maintain proper relationships with supernatural beings created spiritual conditions that invited divine punishment through natural disasters. The flooding served both punitive and purifying functions, destroying corrupted elements within creation, while preserving worthy individuals and communities that maintained proper relationships with divine authority. The survival narratives associated with flood mythology described how selected individuals or communities received divine warnings and supernatural assistance that enabled them to escape destruction and preserve essential knowledge, cultural traditions, and genetic continuity necessary for post-flood renewal. These chosen survivors typically possessed exceptional moral character, maintained proper ritual observances, or received special divine favour that qualified them for preservation during cosmic catastrophe. Their survival required not merely physical escape from floodwaters, but spiritual preparation that enabled them to serve as founders of renewed civilization and transmitters of cultural knowledge to post-flood generations. The world renewal cycles that followed cosmic flooding involved complex processes of terrestrial restoration, divine recreation, and cultural reconstruction that established improved versions of previous cosmic order while incorporating lessons learned from the failures that necessitated destructive intervention. The renewed Earth emerged from receding floodwaters with enhanced fertility, restored natural balance, and purified spiritual conditions that enabled more harmonious relationships between divine and human realms. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities understood these renewal cycles as opportunities for cultural innovation and religious reform that incorporated beneficial changes while preserving essential traditional elements that maintained cultural continuity across catastrophic transitions. The parallels between Slavic flood mythology and corresponding traditions found throughout Indo-European cultures demonstrate the ancient origins and shared development of these cosmogonic narratives within the broader linguistic and cultural family. Comparative analysis reveals structural similarities in flood, causation, survival mechanisms, and renewal processes that suggest common Proto-Indo-European origins for basic flood mythology, while highlighting distinctive Slavic adaptations that reflected specific cultural values and environmental conditions. These shared elements include divine warnings to worthy survivors, the preservation of essential cultural knowledge, and the establishment of improved post-flood civilization that incorporated lessons learned from previous cosmic failures. The creation of humanity within Slavic cosmogonic tradition involved complex divine activities that established human beings as unique creatures, possessing both earthly material substance and celestial spiritual essence, that connected them simultaneously to terrestrial and divine realms of existence. Medieval sources describe how supreme deities shaped human bodies from clay, or earth, retrieved during the original Earth Diver creation, then breathed divine spirit into these material forms to create living beings capable of consciousness, moral choice, and communication with supernatural powers. This dual nature positioned humans as intermediary beings who participated in both material and spiritual aspects of cosmic order, while bearing special responsibilities for maintaining proper relationships between earthly and divine realms. The divine spark within humanity represented the celestial essence that distinguished human beings from other earthly creatures and enabled them to participate in religious activities, receive divine communication, and achieve posthumous existence within supernatural realms governed by cosmic deities. This spiritual component derived directly from divine substance and maintained permanent connection to celestial powers regardless of human moral behaviour or earthly circumstances. However, the effectiveness of this divine connection depended on proper spiritual development, ritual observance, and moral conduct that maintained the purity and receptivity necessary for optimal divine communication and supernatural assistance throughout earthly existence. The relationship between humans and gods operated according to reciprocal obligations that required human worship, offerings, and moral behaviour in exchange for divine protection, guidance, and material prosperity that enabled successful community life within the created order. This theological framework positioned humans as junior partners in cosmic maintenance who contributed to universal stability through their religious activities while receiving supernatural assistance that exceeded their natural capabilities. The partnership required continuous attention from both divine and human participants, with gods providing ongoing support and intervention, while humans maintained proper ritual observances and adherence to moral codes that preserved their worthiness for divine favour. The origins of different social classes within human society reflected divine planning and cosmic organisation that established hierarchical structures paralleling the ranked relationships existing among different categories of deities and supernatural beings. Medieval sources describe creation narratives that explain social differentiation through divine decisions about appropriate roles and responsibilities for different categories of human beings within the cosmic order. These class distinctions possessed religious significance that extended beyond mere social organisation to encompass spiritual functions and ritual responsibilities that contributed to community welfare and cosmic stability through specialised activities performed by different social groups. The warrior class emerged from divine creation as specialised human beings endowed with supernatural courage, enhanced physical capabilities, and spiritual connections to martial deities that enable them to serve as community protectors and agents of divine justice within earthly conflicts. Their creation involved special divine attention that provided additional spiritual essence and direct connections to war gods, whose authority legitimized military activities and provided supernatural assistance during combat situations. Archaeological evidence from elite warrior burials reveals specialized weapons, protective amulets, and ritual objects that indicate the religious dimensions of martial identity and the ongoing spiritual preparation required for effective military service. The priestly class received divine creation as intermediaries between human communities and supernatural powers, possessing enhanced spiritual sensitivity, specialized knowledge of ritual procedures, and direct access to divine communication that enabled them to serve as religious leaders and community guides in matters requiring supernatural intervention. Their creation involved the implantation of additional divine essence that enable perception of spiritual realities normally hidden from ordinary human awareness, along with the intellectual capabilities necessary for maintaining complex religious knowledge and performing elaborate ceremonial activities that maintained proper relationships between earthly and divine realms. The agricultural class emerged from divine creation as the foundation of human society, endowed with knowledge of farming techniques, understanding of seasonal cycles, and spiritual connections to earth deities and nature spirits that enabled them to produce the food and material resources necessary for community survival and prosperity. Their creation emphasized practical skills and spiritual sensitivity to natural forces that enabled successful cooperation with supernatural beings governing agricultural processes, while their ongoing ritual activities contributed to cosmic stability through proper acknowledgement of divine gifts and maintenance of harmonious relationships with earth-based powers. The creation of distinct human social classes established the foundation for diverse regional developments that would characterize Slavic mythological traditions as communities spread across the vast territories stretching from the Baltic shores to the Carpathian Mountains and beyond. The geographical expansion of Slavic peoples between the 6th and 10th centuries AD created opportunities for cultural adaptation and religious innovation that produced distinctive regional variations while maintaining recognizable connections to common Proto-Slavic foundations. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites across this extensive territory reveals how local environmental conditions, contact with non-Slavic populations, and specific historical experiences influenced the development of regional mythological traditions that addressed particular community needs while preserving essential elements of shared Slavic religious heritage. The West Slavic territories encompassed the diverse landscapes of present-day Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Eastern Germany, where communities developed elaborate mythological systems that reflected their position at the crossroads between Germanic, Celtic, and other Indo-European cultural influences. The Polabian Slavs who inhabited the regions between the Elbe and Oder rivers created particularly sophisticated religious traditions that combined indigenous Slavic elements with innovations derived from sustained contact with Germanic tribes and early Christian missionaries. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Rithra, Arkona, and Radagast reveal monumental temple complexes that demonstrate the architectural sophistication and religious complexity achieved by West Slavic communities during their period of political independence and cultural florescence. The elaborate pantheon developed by Polabian Slavic communities reflected their need to address complex political situations involving multiple tribal confederations, foreign military threats, and the challenge of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to changing historical circumstances. Triglav emerged as one of their most distinctive deities, manifesting as a three-headed god whose multiple faces enabled comprehensive observation of past, present, and future events, while providing divine guidance for political decision-making and military strategy. Medieval chroniclers describe his cult centre at Stettin as featuring a massive wooden idol with silver-covered faces, each representing different aspects of temporal authority and cosmic oversight that enabled Triglav to serve as supreme arbiter of community affairs and regional political relationships. The three heads of Triglav possess distinct functions that address different categories of divine responsibility within the complex political environment of West Slavic territories. The first head governed earthly affairs including agriculture, trade relationships, and the daily activities that sustained community prosperity and social stability. The second head supervised celestial matters including weather patterns, seasonal transitions, and the cosmic forces that influenced agricultural success and military effectiveness. The third head controlled underworld realms, including communication with ancestral spirits, the fate of deceased souls, and the chthonic powers that affected community health and supernatural protection. This tripartite division of divine authority enabled Triglav to provide comprehensive supernatural oversight while maintaining specialized attention to different categories of community needs. The divination practices associated with Triglav worship involved sophisticated ceremonies that utilized his prophetic powers to guide political decision-making, military planning, and diplomatic negotiations that determined community survival in the competitive environment of medieval Central Europe. Priests conducted elaborate rituals involving sacred horses whose behaviour provided omens about future political developments, while ceremonial casting of lots revealed divine preferences regarding alliance formations, treaty negotiations, and military campaigns. Archaeological evidence from Triglav cult sites includes specialised divination equipment, ritual vessels used in prophetic ceremonies, and offering deposits that demonstrate the integration of religious authority with practical political leadership throughout West Slavic territories. Rugievit commanded particular reverence among the Rugian Slavs of Rugen Island, where his cult developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the maritime environment and military challenges faced by Baltic coastal communities. This seven-faced deity possessed enhanced observational capabilities that enabled comprehensive surveillance of sea approaches, early detection of naval threats, and supernatural coordination of defensive preparations against Danish and German expansion attempts. Medieval sources describe his temple at Gars as featuring a massive wooden idol, equipped with 7 swords suspended from his belt, symbolising his authority over different categories of warfare and his readiness to provide supernatural assistance during military emergencies that threatened Rugian independence and cultural survival. The maritime aspects of Rugievit worship addressed the specific needs of coastal communities whose prosperity depended on fishing, trade relationships, and naval warfare that required specialised supernatural assistance unavailable from purely terrestrial deities. His 7 faces enabled simultaneous observation of all sea approaches while maintaining vigilant watch over inland territories that could be threatened by overland invasion routes. The deity's association with naval warfare manifested through his ability to control wind patterns, direct sea currents, and influence weather conditions that affected the outcome of maritime conflicts between Slavic communities and their Germanic or Scandinavian adversaries. The weapon symbolism associated with Rugievit reflected sophisticated understanding of military technology and the supernatural forces governing combat effectiveness in the complex warfare environment of medieval Baltic regions. Each of his 7 swords represented different categories of military conflict, including naval battles, siege warfare, cavalry engagements, infantry combat, defensive operations, offensive campaigns, and the supernatural warfare between divine forces that determined the ultimate outcome of earthly conflicts. Archaeological evidence from Rugian military sites reveals weapon deposits, protective amulets, and ritual objects that demonstrate the integration of martial technology with religious practice throughout the warrior culture of Baltic Slavic communities. The political functions of Rugievit worship created religious frameworks that legitimized military leadership, coordinated defensive preparations, and maintained cultural unity among different Rugian communities that faced constant pressure from foreign conquest attempts. Annual festivals held at his primary cult sites attracted representatives from throughout the Rugian Confederation, creating opportunities for military planning, resource coordination, and diplomatic negotiations that strengthened collective resistance against external threats. These gatherings involved elaborate ceremonies that renewed military oaths, blessed weapons and equipment, and invoked divine protection for the coming campaign season when weather conditions enabled large-scale military operations. The distinctive characteristics of West Slavic religious architecture reflected environmental adaptations and cultural innovations that distinguish these communities from their Eastern and Southern Slavic relatives while maintaining recognizable connections to shared mythological foundations. Temple complexes throughout Palabian territories featured elevated wooden structures surrounded by earthwork fortifications that served simultaneously as religious sanctuaries and defensive installations capable of withstanding siege warfare. Archaeological investigation reveals sophisticated construction techniques that incorporated astronomical alignments, acoustic considerations, and symbolic decorative elements that enhance the religious effectiveness of ceremonial activities while providing practical military advantages during periods of conflict. The integration of fortification with religious architecture throughout West Slavic territories reflected the constant military pressure faced by these communities and their need to protect religious centres from destruction by hostile forces seeking to eliminate Slavic cultural identity through the destruction of sacred sites. Temple complexes at major cult centres featured multiple defensive perimeters, hidden escape routes, and underground storage facilities that enabled religious communities to survive extended siege operations while maintaining essential ceremonial activities. The archaeological remains of these fortified sanctuaries demonstrate sophisticated military engineering combined with religious architectural principles that created sacred spaces capable of fulfilling both spiritual and defensive functions. The South Slavic territories encompassed the mountainous regions of the Balkans, where communities developed mythological traditions that reflected their complex interactions with pre-Slavic substrates, Byzantine Christian influences, and the challenging environmental conditions of highland and coastal Mediterranean landscapes. The migration of Slavic peoples into the Balkans during the 6th and 7th centuries brought them into contact with established populations, including Illyrians, Thracians, and Romanized communities whose religious traditions contributed distinctive elements to emerging South Slavic mythological systems. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Balkans reveals the gradual synthesis of Slavic religious traditions with indigenous elements that created regionally distinctive mythological frameworks while preserving recognizable connections to broader Slavic cultural heritage. The pre-Slavic substrates that influenced South Slavic mythological development included ancient Illyrian traditions associated with mountain worship, spring veneration, and chthonic deities that governed underground waters and mineral resources essential for highland community survival. Thracian influences contributed sophisticated understanding of ecstatic religious practices, mystery cult traditions, and shamanic techniques that enabled communication with supernatural beings through altered states of consciousness. The Romanized populations of former imperial territories preserved classical, mythological elements and religious architectural traditions that influenced South Slavic temple construction and ceremonial practices throughout the medieval period. The Veles emerged as the most distinctive supernatural beings within South Slavic mythology, representing the synthesis of indigenous Balkan nature spirit traditions with Slavic concepts of feminine divine power and natural force personification. These fairy-like spirits manifested as beautiful young women with long flowing hair who inhabited mountains, forests, springs, and other natural locations where their presence influenced local weather patterns, water availability, and the health of vegetation essential for community agricultural success. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Veles worship reveals offering deposits placed at springs, mountain peaks, and forest clearings where communities sought their favour through gifts of textiles, jewellery, and food offerings that acknowledged their authority over natural resources. The appearance of Veles spirits reflected their connection to specific natural environments and their role as personifications of the vital forces that animated particular landscapes throughout South Slavic territories. Mountain Vela possessed pale skin and silver hair that reflected the snow-covered peaks they inhabited, while their clothing consisted of flowing white garments that moved like mist around mountain summits. Forest Vela displayed green-tinted skin and brown hair that blended with woodland environments, wearing garments made from leaves and moss that enabled them to become invisible among trees and undergrowth. Water Vela manifested with blue-green hair and translucent skin that shimmered like flowing streams, adorned with garments that appeared to be woven from water itself and decorated with pearls and aquatic vegetation. The supernatural powers possessed by Vela spirits enabled them to control weather phenomena, influence agricultural fertility, and provide assistance or punishment to human communities according to their treatment of natural environments and adherence to traditional ecological practices. These spirits could summon rainstorms to end droughts, direct lightning strikes against those who violated forest protection laws, and cause springs to flow or dry up depending on community behaviour toward natural resources. Their dancing created whirlwinds that could transport objects across great distances, while their singing possessed hypnotic power that could entrance travellers and lead them to hidden treasures or dangerous locations depending on the spirit's intentions. The protective aspects of Vela authority manifested through their guardianship of specific natural locations and their intervention to defend these sacred spaces against human activities that threatened ecological balance or violated traditional use restrictions. Communities that maintained proper relationships with local Vela through regular offerings and adherence to customary environmental practices could expect supernatural assistance in locating water sources, predicting weather changes, and finding medicinal plants necessary for community health. Violations of Vela protection laws resulted in supernatural punishment, including disorientation in familiar territories, equipment failure during important activities, and mysterious illnesses that affected individuals who damaged protected natural sites. The seasonal activities of Vela spirits reflected their integration with agricultural cycles and their role in maintaining the natural processes essential for community survival throughout the challenging environmental conditions of Balkan mountain and coastal regions. Spring brought increased Vela activity as these spirits supervised the renewal of vegetation, the flow of mountain streams, and the return of favourable weather conditions for agricultural activities. Summer Vela celebrations involved elaborate dancing ceremonies that influenced rainfall patterns and maintained the fertility of crops during the critical growing season, when communities depended on supernatural assistance for agricultural success. The cultural significance of Vela traditions within South Slavic communities extended beyond mere nature worship to encompass sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and the human responsibility for maintaining harmonious interactions with natural environments. These spirits served as supernatural enforcement agents for traditional environmental laws that governed hunting, fishing, forest use, and water management practices essential for sustainable community development in the resource-limited environments of Balkan territories. The persistence of Vela traditions throughout centuries of political change and religious conversion demonstrates their fundamental importance in South Slavic cultural identity and environmental adaptation strategies. The East Slavic territories encompass the vast forest and steppe regions of present-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, where communities developed mythological traditions that reflected their adaptation to diverse environmental conditions, ranging from dense woodland areas to open, grassland regions suitable for nomadic and semi-nomadic lifestyles. The expansion of East Slavic peoples across these extensive territories created opportunities for cultural differentiation that produced distinctive regional variations while maintaining shared connections to common Slavic mythological foundations. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites throughout East Slavic territories reveals how different environmental conditions influenced religious practices, architectural traditions, and the development of specialized supernatural beings that addressed particular regional needs and challenges. The Russian mythological traditions that emerged in the northern forest regions reflected adaptation to environments dominated by dense woodlands, extensive river systems, and harsh winter conditions that required specialized supernatural assistance for community survival and prosperity. The forest environment influenced the development of elaborate traditions surrounding woodland spirits, tree worship, and the supernatural beings that governed hunting, fishing, and the extraction of forest resources essential for community economic activities. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Russian forest zone reveals ritual deposits placed in woodland clearings, offerings made at the bases of ancient trees, and ceremonial installations that honoured forest deities and nature spirits, whose cooperation enabled successful adaptation to challenging environmental conditions. The river systems that provided transportation corridors and settlement locations throughout Russian territories influenced the development of sophisticated water spirit traditions that addressed the specific needs of communities dependent on riverine resources and transportation networks. The Volga, Dnieper, Don, and other major rivers served not only as practical transportation routes, but also as sacred geographical features inhabited by powerful supernatural beings whose favour determined community prosperity and survival. Archaeological investigation of riverside settlement sites reveals ritual installations offering deposits and ceremonial objects that demonstrate the integration of water spirit worship with practical activities including fishing, trade, and seasonal migration patterns that characterized East Slavic community life. The Ukrainian mythological developments reflected the synthesis of forest and steppe traditions that emerged as communities adapted to the transitional environments of the forest-steppe zone, where woodland and grassland ecosystems intersected. This environmental diversity created opportunities for cultural innovation that combined elements from both forest-dwelling and nomadic traditions, while developing distinctive supernatural beings and ritual practices that address the unique challenges of life in transitional ecological zones. Archaeological evidence from Ukrainian territories reveals settlement patterns, burial practices, and material culture that demonstrate the creative synthesis of different cultural traditions within unified community frameworks. The steppe influences evident in Ukrainian mythology reflected contact with nomadic peoples and adaptation to grassland environments that required different survival strategies and supernatural assistance than those developed by purely forest-dwelling communities. The open grassland environment influenced the development of sky god worship, solar deity veneration, and equestrian traditions that reflected the importance of horses, cattle, and mobile lifestyle elements within Ukrainian cultural adaptations. Archaeological evidence from steppe regions reveals Kurgan burial traditions, horse sacrifices, and metalwork that demonstrates the integration of nomadic cultural elements with Slavic religious foundations throughout Ukrainian territorial development. The Belarusian mythological traditions emerged from the synthesis of forest-dwelling practices with influences from Baltic cultural contacts that created distinctive regional characteristics while maintaining recognizable connections to broader East Slavic religious heritage. The dense forest environments of Belarusian territories influenced the development of elaborate woodland spirit traditions, tree worship practices, and supernatural beings associated with forest resources and woodland agricultural activities. Archaeological evidence from Belarusian sites reveals ritual installations in forest clearings, offering deposits at sacred groves, and ceremonial objects that demonstrate the sophisticated religious practices that enabled successful adaptation to challenging forest environments. The geographical variations that shaped regional mythological developments across Slavic territories found their most tangible expression through the elaborate ritual systems and ceremonial practices that connected human communities with supernatural forces throughout the annual cycle. Archaeological evidence from ceremonial sites across the vast Slavic cultural sphere reveals sophisticated understanding of cosmic rhythms and seasonal transitions that required coordinated human participation in divine activities through precisely timed festivals, offerings, and community gatherings. These ritual frameworks operated according to astronomical observations that tracked solar and lunar movements while incorporating agricultural cycles, life stage transitions, and supernatural communications that maintained proper relationships between earthly and divine realms. Cupola Night represented the culmination of summer solstice celebrations that acknowledged the maximum power of solar deities while facilitating supernatural transformations that occurred during the briefest night of the annual cycle. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with Kupala festivities reveal large-scale ritual installations, including circular fire arrangements, elevated platforms for ceremonial activities, and specialized areas for water rituals that demonstrate the sophisticated coordination required for these community-wide celebrations. The festival's timing during the summer solstice connected it directly with Dashbog's annual peak of power, when solar energy reached its maximum intensity and created optimal conditions for supernatural activities that required divine solar blessing for successful completion. The fire ceremonies that dominated Kupala Night observances involved the construction of massive communal bonfires, whose flames served multiple ritual functions, including purification of participants, communication with solar deities, and the creation of sacred space where supernatural beings could manifest and interact with human communities. These ceremonial fires required specific construction techniques using particular wood species, arrangement patterns that reflected cosmic symbolism, and lighting procedures that involved the entire community in coordinated activities. Archaeological evidence from Kupala fire sites reveals burned areas containing ritual deposits of ceramic vessels, metal objects, and organic materials that suggest elaborate offering practices accompanied the fire ceremonies throughout the night-long celebrations. The water rituals that complemented fire ceremonies during Kupala Night reflected the festival's integration of opposing elemental forces and the necessity of cosmic balance for maintaining universal harmony. Communities conducted elaborate bathing ceremonies in rivers, lakes, and specially prepared pools that served as sites for ritual purification, supernatural healing, and communication with water spirits, whose cooperation enabled successful agricultural activities throughout the growing season. The combination of fire and water elements during Kupala celebrations created powerful ritual context that enabled participants to experience temporary transcendence of normal physical limitations while receiving supernatural blessings that enhanced their spiritual and material well-being. The herbal gathering activities that characterized Kupala Night reflected sophisticated understanding of plant medicine and the supernatural properties that medicinal herbs acquired during specific astronomical conditions when solar and lunar influences combined to enhance their healing effectiveness. Participants collected particular plant species during precise time periods throughout the night, following traditional knowledge about optimal harvesting moments that maximized the supernatural potency of herbal preparations used for healing, protection, and magical practices throughout the coming year. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with herbal gathering reveals specialized tools, storage containers, and processing equipment that demonstrate the sophisticated botanical knowledge integrated with Kupala ritual practices. The divination ceremonies conducted during Kupala Night utilized the enhanced supernatural activity that occurred during summer solstice conditions to obtain prophetic information about future marriages, agricultural prospects, and community welfare throughout the coming year. Young women performed elaborate fortune-telling rituals involving flower wreaths floated on water, candle flames observed for omens, and dream interpretation practices that revealed supernatural guidance about personal and community futures. These divination activities required specialized knowledge about symbolic interpretation, proper ritual procedures, and the supernatural communications that occurred during optimal cosmic conditions created by summer solstice astronomical alignments. The social functions of Kupala night celebrations extended beyond religious observance to encompass community bonding activities, courtship rituals, and cultural transmission practices that strengthened social cohesion while preserving traditional knowledge across generations. The festival provided opportunities for young people to meet potential marriage partners under supernatural auspices that blessed romantic relationships initiated during this sacred time. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities used Kupala gatherings for trade activities, diplomatic negotiations, and cultural exchanges that maintained connections between different settlements while facilitating the spread of innovations and traditional practices throughout regional networks. Maslenitsa emerged as the elaborate farewell celebration that marked the transition from winter's dormancy to spring's renewal through week-long festivities that combined solar worship with seasonal purification rituals designed to prepare communities for the agricultural activities that would determine prosperity throughout the coming year. The festival's timing during the final week before the spring equinox connected it with cosmic forces governing seasonal transitions and the gradual increase of solar power that enabled the renewal of natural fertility after winter's temporary suspension of agricultural activities. Archaeological evidence from Maslenitsa celebration sites reveals large-scale cooking installations, ceremonial eating areas, and ritual disposal sites that demonstrate the massive food preparation and consumption activities that characterize these pre-spring celebrations. The pancake traditions that dominated Maslenitsa observances reflected sophisticated symbolism connecting circular food shapes with solar imagery while providing practical nutrition that prepared community members for the physical demands of spring agricultural work. These ceremonial foods required specific preparation techniques using ingredients that symbolized different aspects of cosmic renewal, including eggs representing fertility, milk symbolizing abundance, and flour embodying the transformation of stored grain into nourishment for community survival. The communal preparation and consumption of pancakes created opportunities for social bonding, resource sharing, and cultural transmission that strengthened community solidarity while acknowledging divine gifts of sustenance and prosperity. The effigy burning ceremonies that concluded Maslenitsa celebrations involved the construction and ritual destruction of straw figures that represented winter's departing power and the community's readiness to embrace spring's returning vitality. These elaborate straw constructions required community cooperation in gathering materials, artistic skills in creating recognizable human forms, and ceremonial knowledge about proper destruction procedures that ensured effective symbolic communication with seasonal powers. Archaeological evidence from effigy burning sites reveals ash deposits containing ritual objects, ceramic fragments, and metal items that suggest communities included offerings within the burning effigies to enhance their effectiveness as vehicles for supernatural communication. The sledding and outdoor activities that characterize Maslenitsa celebrations reflected the festival's function as a final celebration of winter conditions before spring weather made such activities impossible, while also serving as ritual acknowledgement of seasonal transitions that required community participation in cosmic processes. These recreational activities involved entire communities and coordinated outdoor gatherings that demonstrated social unity while providing physical exercise that prepared participants for the demanding agricultural work that would begin after spring's arrival. The communal nature of these activities created opportunities for conflict resolution, social bonding, and cultural reinforcement that strengthened community cohesion during the challenging transition between seasons. The purification rituals associated with Maslenitsa reflected the festival's function as spiritual preparation for spring renewal and the religious obligations that accompanied the beginning of agricultural activities. Communities conducted elaborate cleansing ceremonies that involved ritual bathing, confession of wrongdoings, and ceremonial disposal of accumulated spiritual pollution that could interfere with spring's renewal processes. These purification practices required specialized knowledge about proper cleansing procedures, appropriate timing for different ritual activities, and the supernatural forces that governed spiritual purification throughout seasonal transitions. Harvest celebrations represented the culmination of agricultural cycles and the community acknowledgement of divine favour that enabled successful crop production throughout the growing season. These autumn festivals involved elaborate Thanksgiving ceremonies, competitive displays of agricultural abundance, and ritual activities that honoured the supernatural beings whose cooperation made possible the food security essential for community survival through winter months. Archaeological evidence from harvest celebration sites reveals large-scale storage facilities, communal processing areas, and ceremonial installations that demonstrate the sophisticated organisation required for managing agricultural surplus, while conducting appropriate religious observances that maintained divine favour for future growing seasons. The first fruit ceremonies that initiated harvest celebrations involved the ritual presentation of the initial crop yielders to supernatural beings whose continued favour ensured ongoing agricultural success and community prosperity. These offerings required specific selection procedures that identified the finest examples of each crop species, proper presentation techniques that demonstrated community respect for divine generosity, and ceremonial consumption practices that enable participants to share in the sacred nature of divinely blessed food. Archaeological evidence from first fruit ceremony sites reveals specialized offering vessels, ritual hearths, and ceremonial eating areas that demonstrate the elaborate procedures involved in these Thanksgiving observances. The competitive aspects of harvest festivals reflected community pride in agricultural achievement, while providing opportunities for knowledge sharing, innovation adoption, and social recognition that encourage continued excellence in farming practices. These competitions involve displays of crop quality, demonstrations of agricultural techniques, and contests that celebrated the skills necessary for successful farming in challenging environmental conditions. The competitive elements created incentives for agricultural innovation while maintaining traditional practices that had proven effective over generations of community experience. The preservation rituals conducted during harvest celebrations addressed the practical necessity of food storage, while acknowledging the supernatural forces that govern the transformation of fresh crops into preserved foods capable of sustaining communities throughout winter months. These ceremonies involved elaborate blessing procedures for storage facilities, ritual preparation of preservation materials, and ceremonial acknowledgement of the supernatural beings whose cooperation prevented spoilage and maintained food quality during extended storage periods. Archaeological evidence from storage sites reveals ritual deposits, protective amulets, and ceremonial installations that demonstrate the integration of practical food preservation with religious practices throughout harvest activities. Life cycle rituals incorporating mythological elements created comprehensive frameworks that connected individual human experiences with cosmic patterns and divine purposes throughout the journey from birth to death and beyond. These ceremonial systems operated according to sophisticated understanding of human development stages and the supernatural influences that affected individual destiny, social integration, and spiritual evolution within community contexts. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with life cycle ceremonies reveals specialized ritual objects, ceremonial installations, and offering deposits that demonstrate the elaborate religious frameworks that governed human transitions between different life stages while maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces. Birth rituals reflected sophisticated understanding of the dangerous transition from pre-existence to earthly life, and the supernatural assistance required to ensure successful integration of new souls into human communities. These ceremonies involved elaborate protective measures designed to shield newborns from malevolent supernatural influences, while facilitating positive connections with protective deities and beneficial spirits. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with birth rituals reveals specialized ceramic vessels, protective amulets, and ritual installations that demonstrate the complex ceremonial procedures involved in welcoming new community members while ensuring their supernatural protection throughout vulnerable early life periods. The naming ceremonies that followed successful birth transitions involved complex divination procedures designed to determine appropriate names that reflected individual destiny, family connections, and supernatural patronage that would influence the child's development throughout their earthly existence. These naming rituals required specialized knowledge about name meanings, divine associations, and the supernatural forces that governed individual fate and social integration. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities maintained elaborate naming traditions that connected individual identity with cosmic forces while preserving family heritage and cultural continuity across generations. The protective rituals conducted during infancy and early childhood addressed the particular vulnerabilities that affected young children before they developed sufficient spiritual strength to resist supernatural threats independently. These ceremonies involved the creation of protective amulets, the establishment of guardian spirit relationships, and regular ritual activities that maintained supernatural protection while facilitating healthy physical and spiritual development. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites reveals specialized children's objects, protective installations, and ritual deposits that demonstrate the sophisticated religious practices that surrounded child-rearing activities throughout early life stages. Coming-of-age ceremonies mark the critical transition from childhood dependence to adult responsibility through elaborate rituals that tested individual capabilities while facilitating supernatural recognition of new social status and spiritual maturity. These initiation ceremonies involved physical challenges, spiritual ordeals, and educational experiences that prepared young people for adult roles while establishing their connections with appropriate patron deities and protective spirits. Archaeological evidence from initiation sites reveals specialized ritual installations, ceremonial objects, and offering deposits that demonstrate the sophisticated procedures involved in facilitating successful transitions to adult community membership. The gender-specific aspects of coming-of-age rituals reflected different adult roles and responsibilities that required distinct spiritual preparation and supernatural patronage for successful fulfillment of social expectations and community obligations. Young men underwent initiation ceremonies that emphasized warrior training, hunting skills, and connection with masculine deities whose protection enabled effective performance of male social roles. Young women participated in ceremonies that focused on domestic skills, fertility preparation, and relationships with feminine deities whose guidance facilitated successful marriage and motherhood within community contexts. The educational components of initiation ceremonies involved transmission of cultural knowledge, religious traditions, and practical skills that enabled new adults to contribute effectively to community welfare while maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces. These educational activities required specialized instructors who possessed both practical expertise and spiritual authority necessary for effective knowledge transmission during the sacred context of initiation rituals. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities maintained elaborate educational systems that combined practical training with religious instruction throughout coming-of-age celebrations. Marriage ceremonies represented the supernatural sanctification of family formation and the establishment of new household units that would contribute to community continuity through reproduction and economic cooperation. These wedding rituals involved elaborate negotiations between families, extensive ceremonial activities that honoured appropriate deities, and the creation of spiritual bonds that connected married couples with supernatural forces governing fertility, prosperity, and domestic harmony. Archaeological evidence from wedding ceremony sites reveals specialised ritual objects, ceremonial installations, and offering deposits that demonstrate the sophisticated religious frameworks that surrounded marriage formation throughout Slavic communities. The divination practices associated with marriage selection involved complex procedures designed to determine supernatural compatibility between potential spouses while ensuring that proposed unions would receive divine favour and contribute to community welfare. These matrimonial divination ceremonies required specialised knowledge about compatibility assessment, divine communication techniques, and the supernatural forces that governed successful marriage relationships. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities maintained elaborate matchmaking traditions that integrated practical considerations with religious requirements for supernatural approval of marriage arrangements. The fertility rituals conducted during wedding ceremonies addressed the fundamental purpose of marriage in ensuring community continuity through reproduction, while acknowledging the supernatural forces that governed conception, pregnancy, and successful childbirth. These ceremonies involved elaborate blessing procedures, the presentation of fertility symbols, and ritual activities that invoked appropriate deities whose cooperation enabled successful family formation and child-rearing activities. Archaeological evidence from wedding sites reveals fertility symbols, ceremonial objects, and ritual installations that demonstrate the integration of reproductive concerns with marriage celebration throughout Slavic wedding traditions. Funeral rites represented the most elaborate and spiritually significant ceremonies within Slavic ritual systems, addressing the complex transition from earthly existence to posthumous destinations, while ensuring proper treatment of deceased community members and maintenance of relationships with ancestral spirits. These mortuary ceremonies involved sophisticated understanding of death as transformation rather than termination, requiring elaborate ritual procedures that facilitated successful soul transitions while preserving beneficial connections between living communities and deceased ancestors. Archaeological evidence from burial sites throughout Slavic territories reveals the sophisticated mortuary practices that reflected complex beliefs about posthumous existence and the ongoing relationships between living and dead community members. Sacred groves represented the most ancient and enduring forms of Slavic religious architecture, where natural forest environments served as temples that required minimal human modification while providing optimal conditions for supernatural manifestations and divine communication. These woodland sanctuaries typically featured ancient trees whose age and size demonstrated their sacred status, along with natural clearings that provided space for ceremonial activities and community gatherings. Archaeological investigation of sacred grove sites reveals ritual deposits placed around tree bases, offering installations within natural clearings and pathways that connected different ceremonial areas within extensive woodland temple complexes that served multiple communities throughout regional networks. The selection criteria for sacred groves reflected sophisticated understanding of natural environments and the geographical features that facilitated optimal supernatural activity and divine manifestation. Communities identified appropriate woodland locations based on factors including tree species composition, water source proximity, astronomical alignments, and natural acoustic properties that enhance ceremonial effectiveness. The most sacred groves featured combinations of oak, ash, and birch trees whose different symbolic associations created comprehensive religious environments that addressed various community, spiritual needs while providing connections with the different categories of supernatural beings. The maintenance practices associated with sacred groves involved careful preservation of natural conditions while incorporating minimal human modifications that enhanced ceremonial functionality without disrupting the forest environment that provided the sanctuary's spiritual power. These maintenance activities included selective vegetation management, pathway construction, and the installation of ritual objects that facilitated ceremonial activities while preserving the natural character that made these locations effective for supernatural communication. Archaeological evidence reveals that communities maintained sacred groves for centuries through careful stewardship that balanced human religious needs with environmental preservation requirements. The sacred groves that had served as the spiritual heart of Slavic communities for centuries began to face systematic challenges as Christian missionaries, supported by political authorities, initiated comprehensive campaigns to eliminate pagan religious practices throughout Slavic territories. The process of Christianization, which commenced in earnest during the 9th century with the missions of Cyril and Methodius to Great Moravia, represented not merely religious conversion, but a fundamental transformation of cultural identity that would reshape Slavic civilization. Archaeological evidence from former sacred grove sites reveals the deliberate destruction of ancient trees, the construction of churches over pagan sanctuaries, and the systematic removal of ritual installations that had served communities for generations of religious observance. Prince Vladimir's conversion of Kievan Rus in 988 AD marked a pivotal moment in this transformation, as political authority aligned with Christian doctrine to mandate the abandonment of traditional religious practices throughout one of the most powerful Slavic political entities. The primary chronicle describes the dramatic destruction of Perun's idol in Kiev, where the thunder god statue was dragged through the streets, beaten with sticks, and cast into the Dnieper River while crowds of the newly baptized citizens looked on. This symbolic act represented more than the removal of a religious artifact. It demonstrated the complete reversal of cosmic order that had governed Slavic understanding of divine authority and supernatural protection for centuries of cultural development. The systematic suppression of pagan practices required comprehensive administrative efforts that extended far beyond the destruction of major cult sites to encompass the elimination of household shrines, seasonal festivals, and the daily ritual observances that had integrated supernatural acknowledgement into every aspect of community life. Christian authorities issued detailed prohibitions against specific practices including offerings to household spirits, seasonal fire ceremonies, divination activities, and the veneration of natural features such as springs, trees, and stones that had served as focal points for traditional religious observance. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites reveals the abandonment of ritual hearths, the removal of protective amulets, and the cessation of offering practices that had maintained relationships between human communities and supernatural beings for generations. The resistance to Christianization varied significantly across different Slavic territories, with some regions maintaining traditional practices for centuries after official conversion, while others embraced the new religion with enthusiasm that reflected genuine spiritual conviction or practical political calculation. The Palabian Slavs of the Baltic coast maintained their elaborate temple complexes and warrior cults well into the 12th century, requiring repeated military campaigns by German Christian forces to achieve complete religious transformation. Archaeological excavations at Arkona reveal evidence of temple rebuilding and ritual continuity that persisted despite repeated destruction attempts, suggesting that communities made significant efforts to preserve traditional religious practices, despite overwhelming political and military pressure to abandon them. The transformation of Slavic deities into Christian saints represented one of the most sophisticated strategies employed by church authorities to facilitate religious transition, while acknowledging the deep cultural significance of traditional supernatural beings. Perun, the thunder god whose authority had dominated Slavic religious consciousness for centuries, underwent gradual transformation into the prophet Elijah, whose biblical association with fire from heaven and control over rainfall provided theological continuity that preserved essential elements of thunder god worship within acceptable Christian frameworks. This syncretic development enabled communities to maintain familiar patterns of supernatural relationship while redirecting their religious devotion toward figures recognized by Christian doctrine. The process of saintly transformation involved careful theological work that identified appropriate Christian figures whose attributes and legendary activities paralleled the functions of traditional Slavic deities sufficiently to enable smooth religious transition. Veles, the chthonic god of cattle magic and the underworld, became associated with St. Blaise, whose patronage of livestock and reputation for miraculous healing provided continuity for communities whose economic survival depended on supernatural protection of their animals. Archaeological evidence from rural churches throughout Slavic territories reveals the persistence of cattle blessing ceremonies, protective rituals for livestock, and seasonal observances that maintained traditional agricultural practices within Christian ceremonial frameworks. The feminine deities of Slavic tradition underwent particularly complex transformations, as Christian theology struggled to accommodate the prominent role of goddess figures within acceptable doctrinal boundaries. The Rozhenitsy who had governed birth and destiny found expression through devotion to the Virgin Mary and various female saints whose intercession provided supernatural assistance for childbirth, family protection, and the determination of individual fate according to divine will. This transformation required significant theological adaptation that preserved the essential functions of feminine divine power while redirecting worship toward figures whose veneration aligned with Christian concepts of proper religious devotion and supernatural hierarchy. Some Slavic deities underwent demonization rather than saintly transformation, as Christian authorities classified certain supernatural beings as evil spirits, whose worship represented dangerous association with diabolic forces that threatened Christian salvation. Baba Yaga retained her ambivalent character, but became increasingly associated with witchcraft and malevolent magic that required Christian protection and exorcism for effective resistance. The forest spirits, water demons, and household beings that had served protective functions within traditional religious frameworks were reinterpreted as tempting devils whose influence led Christians away from proper religious devotion toward dangerous supernatural practices that threatened their eternal salvation. The demonization process reflected theological concerns about maintaining clear distinctions between acceptable Christian supernatural relationships and the prohibited practices associated with pagan tradition. Church authorities developed elaborate classification systems that distinguished between beneficial supernatural intervention through Christian saints and angels versus the malevolent influence of demons and evil spirits, whose activities required constant vigilance and spiritual resistance. This theological framework enabled the preservation of supernatural worldview elements, while redirecting spiritual energy toward Christian-approved practices that maintained ecclesiastical authority over religious experience and community spiritual guidance. Folk Christianity emerged as the practical synthesis between traditional Slavic religious practices and Christian doctrine that characterized rural religious life throughout the medieval period and beyond. This syncretic system preserved essential elements of seasonal observance, supernatural protection, and community ritual, while incorporating Christian symbols, prayers, and theological concepts that satisfied ecclesiastical requirements for orthodox religious practice. Archaeological evidence from rural areas reveals the persistence of traditional ritual objects alongside Christian artifacts, suggesting that communities maintained dual religious systems that addressed different spiritual needs through parallel supernatural relationships. The seasonal festivals that had structured Slavic religious life underwent transformation rather than elimination, as communities adapted traditional celebrations to align with the Christian liturgical calendar while preserving essential elements of cosmic acknowledgement and supernatural communication. Kupala Night became associated with the feast of St. John the Baptist, whose connection with water baptism and purification rituals provided theological justification for maintaining traditional fire and water ceremonies within Christian observance. The summer solstice celebrations continued with modified symbolism that emphasized Christian themes, while preserving the community bonding, supernatural blessing, and seasonal acknowledgement that had made these festivals essential for rural social and spiritual life. The persistence of traditional practices within Christian frameworks created complex religious landscapes where communities maintained multiple layers of supernatural relationship that addressed different categories of spiritual need through various channels of divine communication. Household spirits continued to receive acknowledgement through practices disguised as Christian devotion, while seasonal observances preserved traditional timing and essential ritual elements despite modified theological interpretation. This religious complexity enabled communities to maintain cultural continuity, while adapting to changing political and ecclesiastical requirements that demanded conformity to Christian doctrine and practice. The preservation of mythological knowledge faced significant challenges as oral transmission systems that had maintained traditional narratives for centuries encountered systematic efforts to eliminate pagan cultural elements from community memory and educational practices. Christian authorities recognized that mythological stories, even when stripped of explicit religious content, preserved worldview elements and cultural values that competed with Christian doctrine for community loyalty and spiritual authority. The result was a comprehensive campaign to replace traditional storytelling with Christian narratives, saints' lives, and biblical stories that provided alternative cultural content while eliminating the supernatural framework that had sustained Slavic religious consciousness. Folklore collectors who began systematic documentation of traditional narratives during the 18th and 19th centuries encountered communities where mythological knowledge had survived centuries of suppression through adaptation, fragmentation, and integration with Christian elements that disguised pagan content within acceptable cultural forms. These collectors, including figures such as Alexander Afanasiev in Russia and Vuk Karadzic in Serbia, discovered that traditional stories had evolved into fairy tales, legends, and folk narratives that preserved essential mythological elements while avoiding direct conflict with Christian doctrine through symbolic transformation and narrative displacement. The challenges of reconstructing pre-Christian beliefs from post-conversion sources require careful analysis of the multiple layers of cultural transformation, theological reinterpretation, and deliberate modification that affected traditional narratives throughout centuries of Christian influence. Scholars must distinguish between authentic archaic elements that preserve genuine pre-Christian religious concepts and later additions that reflect Christian theological concerns, literary influences, or romantic nationalist interpretations that projected modern cultural values onto ancient traditions. This analytical work involves comparative study of related mythological systems, linguistic analysis of religious terminology, and archaeological investigation of material culture that provides independent evidence for traditional religious practices. The survival of Slavic mythological elements within folk traditions demonstrates the remarkable persistence of cultural memory and the human need for supernatural relationships that transcend the boundaries of official religious doctrine. Despite centuries of systematic suppression, transformation, and reinterpretation, essential elements of Slavic mythological thinking continue to influence community life, seasonal observance, and individual spiritual practice throughout the Christian period. The household spirits, nature deities, and protective beings that had served Slavic communities for generations found new expression within folk Christianity that preserved their essential functions while adapting their manifestation to changing religious requirements. The academic study of Slavic mythology that emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries faced the complex task of reconstructing coherent religious systems from fragmented sources that reflected centuries of cultural transformation and deliberate suppression. Scholars such as Louis Leger, Alexander Potebnia, and Roman Jakobson developed methodological approaches that combined linguistic analysis, comparative mythology, and ethnographic investigation to identify authentic elements of pre-Christian religious tradition within the complex matrix of folk culture that had preserved mythological elements in modified forms. The reconstruction process revealed the sophisticated theological thinking and complex social organization that had characterized pre-Christian Slavic religious systems, demonstrating that these traditions represented fully developed cultural achievements rather than primitive superstitions that deserved replacement by more advanced religious systems. The pantheon structures, seasonal observances, and ritual practices that emerged from scholarly investigation showed remarkable consistency across different Slavic cultural groups while displaying the regional variations and cultural adaptations that reflected the creative vitality of traditional religious development. The legacy of Slavic mythology extends far beyond historical curiosity to encompass ongoing cultural influences that continue to shape literary traditions, artistic expression, and popular culture throughout the modern Slavic world. The supernatural beings, heroic narratives, and cosmic concepts that originated in pre-Christian religious tradition have found new expression in contemporary literature, film, and artistic creation that draws upon mythological themes while adapting them to modern cultural contexts and aesthetic sensibilities. The twilight of the old gods did not represent the complete disappearance of Slavic mythological thinking, but rather its transformation into new cultural forms that preserved essential elements of traditional worldview within modified frameworks that could survive in Christian cultural environments. The household spirits became folk beliefs, the seasonal festivals became cultural celebrations, and the heroic narratives became fairy tales that continued to transmit fundamental values and supernatural concepts across generations of cultural change. This transformation process demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of mythological thinking and its capacity to preserve essential cultural elements despite systematic efforts at elimination and replacement. The study of this transformation process provides valuable insights into the mechanisms of cultural change, religious conversion, and the preservation of traditional knowledge within changing historical circumstances. The Slavic experience of Christianization illustrates both the power of systematic cultural transformation and the persistence of deeply rooted cultural elements that resist complete elimination despite centuries of suppression and reinterpretation. Understanding this historical process contributes to broader knowledge about cultural continuity, religious change, and the complex relationships between official doctrine and popular practice that characterize religious life in all historical periods and cultural contexts. Thus, the ancient gods of the Slavic peoples did not simply vanish with the arrival of Christianity, but underwent a profound metamorphosis that allowed their essence to survive within new religious and cultural frameworks. Their stories, transformed into folklore and embedded within Christian traditions, continue to provide meaning and connection to the natural world for countless generations, ensuring that the spiritual wisdom of the pre-Christian Slavs would endure as an integral part of their cultural heritage for centuries to come.